Those who stay watching the rain. What you see is an oil painting, the kind that deserves time, silence, and a good place on the screen. You can stay with just that. Let it be ambience, decor, quiet company, or stay for the story I'm about to tell you. One that was written to live beside art exactly like this. The experience is entirely yours. Chapter: The Letter to the One Who Went to Paris. Ernesto Vidal had a habit of arriving late to his own life. It wasn't something he had decided consciously. The way important things are decided with signed documents or words spoken aloud in front of someone who witnesses them. It was more of a disposition of the soul, a way of inhabiting time that had settled into him with the same quiet efficiency with which dust settles onto furniture that nobody moves. He arrived late to conversations, late to conclusions, late to love. He arrived late even to his own pain, which was perhaps the strangest part. When something bad happened, Ernesto would keep functioning with apparent normalcy for days or weeks, and only much later, in some unpredictable and always inconvenient moment, would the blow arrive with a delay and find him defenseless, without armor, in the middle of an ordinary morning. That was him. That had always been him. A man who processed life with the same slowness with which certain old photographs took time to develop. Gradually, in the dark, and sometimes with the colors slightly wrong. That February afternoon, while the rain hammered the windows of his apartment on the 4th floor of a nameless building in a city he had never fully chosen, Ernesto arrived late to a question that had been waiting for him for years. At what exact moment did I become the man I never was? The question didn't arrive with fanfare. Important questions never do. They don't arrive in solemn moments. Not in the nights when you're prepared to receive them with the appropriate dignity. They arrive when you're looking for a utility bill in the bottom drawer of your desk. That drawer everyone has. The one that functions as a chaotic archive for everything you don't know where to put. Dead batteries. Buttons, orphaned from their shirts. Manuals for appliances that no longer exist. Business cards from people you swore you'd call and never did. Coins from countries you no longer visit. Among that disorder, he found the notebook. It had a hard cover, dark blue, with the corners slightly bent from time, and the pressure of other objects stacked on top. He didn't remember buying it, or maybe he did, vaguely, the way you remember dreams mid-morning. With a certainty that they existed, but without being able to reconstruct the details. He'd probably bought it in another moment of his life, on an afternoon when he'd felt briefly capable of writing something. On one of those nights when you convince yourself you're going to change and write the intention down somewhere physical to give it real weight, to turn the feeling into an object. The notebook was blank, completely blank, like every intention he'd ever had. He held it in his hands for a moment that lasted longer than it seemed. Outside, the rain continued its patient, indifferent work, that work the rain does equally, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Regardless of whether the world it's soaking is going through something important or simply waiting for Wednesday to pass. Ernesto sat down in the desk chair, a rolling office chair he'd rescued when they moved him to a different floor 3 years ago. One that squeaked softly with every small shift in position, as if quietly protesting each minor readjustment. And opened the notebook to the first page. The pen was on the desk. Blue. One of those disposable ones you find everywhere and never deliberately bought. Picked it up, and he wrote, without thinking, with a speed that surprised him because Ernesto was a man who overthought everything before doing anything, and that night his hand got ahead of his mind. To you, who boarded the plane when I stayed in the terminal watching it take off. Stop. He read the sentence twice. 3 times, and something inside him, something that had been asleep or anesthetized, or simply resigned to staying still for too long, shifted with a discomfort that wasn't exactly pain but wasn't anything pleasant either. It was more like stretching a muscle that had gone too long without use. That mixture of relief and sting that signals something was atrophied and is now waking up. It was Ernesto understood with a clarity that caught him off guard. The feeling of being honest. He'd gone so long without it that he almost didn't recognize it. He kept writing. He was 22 when the scholarship letter arrived. That needs to be said precisely, because details matter when you're trying to reconstruct the exact moment your life could have been something else. Not 21, Not 23. 22, which is that strange, undefined age when you can no longer pretend your truly young youth is no longer an excuse. Something is expected of you now, but you don't quite have permission to take yourself completely seriously either. Because at 22, it's still possible that everything is a rehearsal, that real life starts later. It's an age of transition that doesn't know it is one, and that ignorance has consequences. The letter came in a white envelope with an institutional letterhead and arrived on a Tuesday, which also matters, because Tuesdays are days without their own character. Days that neither promise nor threaten anything. Days that happen between Monday with its weight of new beginnings and Wednesday with its logic of the midpoint. Tuesdays are the most anonymous days of the week, and yet that particular Tuesday carried inside it, folded in 3 parts with the bureaucratic neatness of documents that change lives without knowing it. A complete and fully formed invitation to be someone else. The scholarship was to study comparative literature in Paris. 1 full year, with housing in a university residence in the 5th arrondissement, the neighborhood of old bookshops and cafes, where Sartre had thought his best ideas and Hemingway had drunk his worst nights, with a monthly stipend sufficient to live without luxury, but with dignity. With access to libraries Ernesto had only seen in photographs, and that produced in him a kind of sacred vertigo. The type of vertigo that doesn't frighten but calls. He'd filled out the application 6 months earlier, on an August afternoon when he'd felt, briefly, invincible. One of those afternoons when the light falls a certain way and the day's exhaustion hasn't arrived yet, and you believe, for a few hours, that you can be the most complete version of yourself. He'd filled it out the way you buy lottery tickets, with a comfortable certainty that you won't win, with the freedom that certainty provides, with the generosity of someone betting what he doesn't actually believe he'll lose. E1. And Ernesto, holding that white envelope in the kitchen of the apartment he shared with his mother. That apartment with cream-colored walls that had once been white, and that time had been gradually yellowing, without anyone making the decision to repaint them, felt something that took him years to name correctly. In the moment, he called it fear. Later he called it responsibility, which is the elegant, socially acceptable name we give to fear when we want it to sound like a virtue, when we want our cowardice to look like a form of maturity. Much later, in a therapy session he abandoned before finishing, because finishing things was also something he found disproportionately difficult. A soft-voiced psychologist with uncomfortable questions told him it was probably self-sabotage, and Ernesto nodded politely but thought inwardly that word didn't quite cover it either. That it was too clinical, too tidy for something that was in reality much messier and much more human. The truth still without a name, was something simpler and more devastating at the same time. In the moment of having exactly what he wanted, he didn't know what to do with it, and that incapacity didn't come from stupidity or laziness. It came from something deeper and harder to correct. It came from the fact that throughout his entire life, no one, not even himself, had taught him that he deserved the things he wanted. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table when he read the letter. She was drinking coffee. That 4 o'clock coffee that was one of her invariable rituals, one of those small anchors of certainty that people build around uncertainty in order to keep functioning. She'd been alone for 2 years since his father left, not dramatically, not cinematically, but with the slow, quiet efficiency of men who leave without leaving. First emotionally, no longer present in conversations, though his body remained in the chair. Then physically, with absences that became the norm. And finally, with a small suitcase on a Sunday morning. No scene, no shouting, nothing large enough to be used as a story afterward. Just the suitcase and the door and the silence that followed, which was perhaps the loudest thing of all. Ernesto's mother hadn't said anything explicit that afternoon when he came home with the envelope. She hadn't said don't go or cried or deployed any of the resources of family drama that Ernesto, with some embarrassment, had anticipated. She was simply there, with her coffee, with her silence, with that presence of hers that was quiet and constant, like the background noise of an appliance, so permanent that you stop noticing it, but so necessary that when it shuts off, the resulting silence is of a different and disturbing kind. She hadn't said anything, and Ernesto, who was a specialist in hearing what wasn't said, in reading silences with the same attention others give to words, had heard her perfectly. His mother didn't need to ask him to stay. She had already asked, without words, simply by sitting there drinking coffee at 4 in the afternoon in an apartment too quiet for one person. She had asked with the 2 years of solitude Ernesto had watched accumulate like water in a container with no drain. She had asked with every dinner when the two of them had eaten in front of the television without talking much. With every night when Ernesto had heard from his room the sound of her turning off the living room lights and shuffling toward her bedroom with that specific slowness of people who have no reason to hurry anywhere because on the other side of every door there is only more silence. Ernesto didn't go to Paris. He called the institution the next day, with a voice he carefully modulated to sound firm and calm and mature, and declined a scholarship with an excuse that seemed intimate. Completely reasonable and even noble. Family circumstances that require my presence. The woman who answered the phone said, "I understand. What a shame," in the uniform tone of someone who has heard everything and no longer distinguishes between genuine excuses and the excuses people use to protect themselves from themselves. And she hung up. And that was it. That's how small the moment was when Ernesto Vidal chose not to choose. That quiet, that domestic, that completely devoid of the gravity it deserved. No thunder, no soundtrack, no one approaching to tell him he had just made the most important decision of his life while making it the way you turn off a light you no longer need with the same unconsciousness. To Samia, that night, he slept well. That also needs to be said. He slept well. No insomnia, no anguish, no premonition of catastrophe. That's the treacherous part of bad decisions. Sometimes they don't hurt right away. Sometimes the body accepts them with a calm you mistake for peace, when really it's just the time the wound takes to reach the surface. In the months that followed, Ernesto constructed a coherent and fairly convincing narrative about why he had done the right thing. The stories we tell ourselves about our own cowardice are always the most elaborate, the best structured, the ones with the most supporting evidence and the fewest visible holes. His had several elements. His mother needed him. He was the only emotional support available. Paris could wait. Other opportunities would come. A year abroad was too long to leave a woman alone who had just been through a difficult separation, and comparative literature wasn't exactly what he wanted to study anyway. This last point was added later, when the narrative needed an additional argument. The story held up well. It was the kind of story you can tell at a dinner without anyone questioning it, the kind that even generates a little admiration. How responsible, how mature, how much he loves his mom. And Ernesto told it, not often, because he wasn't the type of man who needed constant external validation, but enough times that the story solidified, became part of the official version of himself, integrated into the narrative of who Ernesto Vidal was, and why his life had the shape it had. What the story didn't include, because the stories that protect us always omit one carefully chosen part, was this. His mother had been fine. Not perfectly fine, not without difficulty, but functional, upright, with her 4 o'clock coffee and her friends from the neighborhood and a routine built with the quiet resilience of women of her generation who learned not to fall apart because no one ever taught them they were allowed to. She didn't need him, not in the way Ernesto had decided she needed him. And somewhere in a secret, poorly lit corner of himself, Ernesto had known that. He had always known it. His mother was the perfect excuse, precisely because she was real. She contained enough truth that the lie didn't show, enough genuine weight that Ernesto could look at it straight without blinking. The real truth, the one living in that secret, poorly lit place, was simpler and more embarrassing. Ernesto was afraid of arriving in Paris and not being enough. He was afraid of sitting in those classrooms full of people who had grown up reading in multiple languages and discovering that he, who considered himself special in the small context of his local university, was absolutely ordinary in the larger world. He was afraid of total freedom, which is paradoxically one of the most paralyzing fears that exist. When there's no one to tell you what to do and where to go and when to come back. When the entire weight of your own life falls on your own shoulders with no possibility of delegating it or sharing it. Some men flourish and others go still. Ernesto already knew, without having tested himself, which one he would be. Or maybe he didn't know. Maybe that was the cruelest part of all, that he never found out. Now, 15 years later, Ernesto kept writing in the blue notebook while the rain continued its monologue outside. It had passed 9 o'clock without him noticing. He hadn't turned on the desk lamp and was writing in the half-dark, in the faint clarity coming in from the street, that orange glow of streetlights that makes everything look like it's happening in a low-budget film with a lot of heart. There was something freeing about writing to someone who didn't exist, about constructing that imaginary recipient with the absolute liberty of someone who doesn't have to answer to anyone or impress anyone. Because the other Ernesto, the Paris one, didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have arrived there and triumphed or become a celebrated writer or found eternal love in a bookshop on the Rue de Rivoli while looking for a copy of Camus. The other Ernesto only had to have gotten on the plane. Just that. The rest could have been a complete and glorious disaster that was entirely his own, and it still would have been worth it, because at least it would have been his disaster. Built with his own hands and inhabited with the specific dignity of someone who chose his own path. Even if that path led nowhere particularly luminous. "I imagined you on the plane," Ernesto wrote, and the sentence arrived with an ease that surprised him, as if it had been formed for years and had only been waiting for the paper. "I imagine you were afraid too. I imagine you looked out the window when Paris appeared below, through that haze the city always seems to carry, and felt like you weren't enough for what was waiting for you. You would have felt that regardless with Paris or without it, because that's what we always feel. Because inadequacy isn't a matter of geography but of constitution. The difference is that you felt it from above, looking down, and I felt it from below, watching you take off. And there's a fundamental difference between those two positions that took me 15 years to understand. You, feeling inadequate at 30,000 feet, was still moving. I, feeling inadequate on solid ground, stayed still. And stillness doesn't hurt at first. That's the dangerous thing about stillness. It doesn't hurt at first. Stopped. He read what he'd written, and for the first time in a long time and too long, had the sensation of having said something true. Not something correct or useful or socially approved. Something true, which is an entirely different category and a much rarer one, and which has the particular property that once you say it, you can no longer pretend you don't know it. The rain shifted rhythm for a moment, grew denser and more urgent, as if it too were arriving at some conclusion, then eased back into that soft, continuous sound. It is almost silence, but not quite. Ernesto kept writing. He had met Valentina Rios in his second year of the program, in a seminar on Latin American narrative that met Thursday afternoons in a third-floor classroom with a window facing a mango tree. They had the habit, in spring, of drifting its sweet, distracting fragrance through the middle of discussions about Rolfo Valentina, had sat 2 seats to his right and said something about Pedro Paramo that Ernesto never forgot. Not because it was extraordinarily brilliant. Togit was, but because it was delivered with that particular brand of conviction without arrogance that Ernesto had always admired and never managed to replicate. The conviction of someone who means what they say without needing others to agree. She was 21. Dark hair, cut without much care, with the kind of carelessness that on some people looks like an accident, and on others looks exactly like what it is. A decision. She had the habit of talking with her hands in constant motion, as if words needed to be sculpted in the air in addition to being spoken. The habit of interrupting her own sentences midway when a thought accelerated faster than language could follow, leaving unfinished phrases floating between them like questions waiting to be resumed. She read with a pencil in hand and underlined according to criteria Ernesto never fully deciphered. She drank her coffee black and with a faint expression of mild displeasure that repeated with every sip, as if she always forgot that black coffee tastes like black coffee and the bitterness caught her off guard each time. They became friends with the speed that only happens in youth and in contexts where ideas are present, when conversations have substance from the start, and you don't have to build familiarity from basic data and social formalities. They argued about books with the intensity of people arguing about something that genuinely matters, which is the only valid way to argue about books. They shared the same enthusiasm for Borges, and the same discomfort with a certain kind of romantic poetry that was too pleased with itself. They walked after class through the campus with the slowness of people who don't want to reach the end of the conversation, taking unnecessary detours, always choosing the longer path. Ernesto had been in love with her since the 3rd month. He knew it with the same clarity with which, the things that aren't convenient. Suddenly, completely, without intermediate stages or reasonable doubts. And with that same clarity, that same completeness, he decided to do nothing about it, because Ernesto had a theory, never explicitly formulated but operational in every relevant aspect of his life, according to which good things that exist as possibilities are safer than good things that are actively pursued. A possibility can't reject you. A possibility can't go wrong. A possibility exists in the perfect, untouched space of what could be, free from the disappointment and risk and loss that any real thing brings with it. Valentina, as a possibility, was perfect. Ernesto preferred to keep her that way. For nearly 2 years, he built around that decision a system of behavior that was simultaneously completely coherent and completely absurd. Present without being available, close without being clear. Cultivating the friendship with a care that bordered on meticulous, precisely so that the friendship wouldn't grow in any direction that would require him to be honest. And Valentina, who was intelligent in the most inconvenient possible way. Intelligent about the things that matter, not the things you can learn from a textbook, would look at him sometimes with an expression Ernesto categorized as affection, and which was perhaps something else. Perhaps confusion. Perhaps impatience. Perhaps the specific expression of someone who is waiting for the other person to take a step that the other person isn't taking and who is beginning to understand, slowly, that the step isn't coming. Valentina applied for the scholarship to Ernesto knew because she told him herself during one of their Wednesday lunches in the campus cafeteria, where that way she had of announcing important things mixed in with ordinary ones, without changing her tone, as if everything carried the same weight. Or as if she'd decided that giving weight to things was a way of showing too much respect to fear. "I sent in the application for that Paris scholarship," she said, opening her yogurt. "The comparative literature one. I probably won't get it, but why not try?" Ernesto said it was a great idea. He said it with genuine conviction because it was, and he didn't mention that he'd also sent in his application, because doing so would have created something between them he preferred not to create. A shared expectation, a common project, the possibility of a future he would have to face in company rather than manage alone. When the results came and Valentina was selected, Ernesto's reaction was honest happiness, mixed with something he couldn't quite locate. Something with the texture of an opportunity that he didn't recognize as such until much later. When his own results arrived and he was selected too, the reaction was the one already described. The envelope, the kitchen, his mother's coffee, the phone call, the woman who said what a shame and hung up. He didn't tell Valentina he'd been selected. That also needs to be said, uncomfortable as it is. He didn't tell her. He said he hadn't made it, with the same naturalness with which you tell the lies you've decided to believe yourself. And Valentina made that expression of hers genuine frustration, mouth slightly twisted, and said, "Ooh, that's such a bummer. You would have been incredible there." And Ernesto nodded and shrugged and said there would be other opportunities. There were no other opportunities, or territory. And he handled them the same way. He went to see her off at the airport on a Saturday in October. The sky completely gray, and that specific early season cold in the air that smells like something ending. He carried one of her bags to the check-in area. That bag too heavy because Valentina was the kind of person who packs books in her carry-on and clothes in her checked luggage, with a hierarchy of priorities that Ernesto found endearing and completely consistent with who she was. He wished her safe travels with a smile that in the moment he believed was entirely sincere, and that only years later, reviewing it from a distance, he recognized as the smile of someone performing the version of himself he can stand to see in the mirror, genuinely felt on the surface and hollow directly underneath. Valentina hugged him with that way she had of hugging, always a beat longer than expected, a second or two past the point where formal embraces end, into that additional territory that can mean many things or nothing, and which Ernesto had spent 2 years interpreting and misinterpreting. She smelled like that perfume of hers that was citrusy and slightly earthy at the same time. One of those scents the brain files under permanent without asking permission, so that years later, in completely different contexts, it returns without warning and brings everything stored alongside it. "Take care of yourself," Valentina said, and she said it while looking at him in a way Ernesto couldn't read, or could, and chose not to understand, which is not the same thing but produces similar results. "You too," he said. "Right. You too, she said. And that was it. Valentina disappeared behind the security checkpoint with her overloaded bag, and her dark hair, and her habit of leaving sentences unfinished. Ernesto stayed in the airport for a stretch of time he couldn't precisely measure, watching the point where she'd disappeared with the useless attention of someone waiting for something to return when he already knows it won't. Then he looked at the departures board, watching the status of the Paris flight change from boarding 2. Departed with the mechanical indifference of systems that don't know what they're announcing, and he stayed there until it changed, which is the most final word in airport vocabulary, the one that leaves no room for nuance. Outside it was raining. He took a cab home. The driver had the radio on with a song Ernesto wouldn't remember afterward. The city moved past the window with its usual indifference, not knowing and not caring that something irreversible had just occurred in the life of one of its residents, that a 22-year-old man had gone still at the exact moment he should have moved, and that this, though he didn't know it yet, would have consequences arriving with the same delay as everything in Ernesto Vidal's life. On a rainy February evening 15 years later, the conversation with the other Ernesto began at 10:15 at night, in that in-between state of sleep and waking that psychology books call hypnagogic, and that Ernesto simply called when the guard comes down. It wasn't hallucination or dreaming or any of those clinical categories requiring a professional to manage. It was more like imagining with too much intensity, like giving an inner voice so much substance and presence that it begins responding on its own terms, with its own arguments, its own logic. The particular discomfort of something you don't fully control even though you know it's coming from inside you. The other, Ernesto, sat across from him. Not on the couch, but in the dining chair that was always empty. The chair Ernesto had never quite gotten around to using for anything because he lived alone and one chair was enough for his needs. And yet he'd bought the table with 4, because buying a table with 1 chair is a statement too explicit about the kind of life you're living. The other Ernesto sat there and looked at him with an expression that wasn't exactly compassion, but wasn't disdain or triumph either. None of the attitudes you might expect from a version of yourself who made better decisions. It was something more complex and more unsettling. The look of someone who knows you too well to hate you, who understands the origin of every one of your flaws because they share those flaws, but who inhabits them differently. He was the same. Ernesto. The same slightly crooked nose, the same habit of squinting when thinking, the same hands a little larger than the rest of the body seemed to suggest, but with something different that was hard to pin down. Something in the posture, something in the way he occupied the chair as if he had every right to be there, as if he wasn't waiting for someone to tell him he could stay. "Why, no," the other Ernesto said, and his voice was like Ernesto's, but with less hesitation at the edges. Less of that soft, wavering Ernesto put at the end of almost every sentence, as if perpetually seeking confirmation that what he'd just said was valid. "Why write to me now, 15 years later?" "Because I found the notebook," Ernesto answered, and knew the moment he said it that it was an insufficient response. The kind of answer that describes the mechanism but not the cause. "You've spent 15 years finding excuses," the other said. "The notebook is just the most recent one. Before that it was work. Before that it was the move. Before that it was no time. Before that it wasn't worth it. You've spent 15 years looking for the right moment to take stock, and the right moment never arrives, because you make sure it doesn't." The notebook appeared that busy. Or, don't look for more meaning in it than it has. Ernesto considered this. There was something irritating about that other version of himself. Something that wasn't exactly arrogance. Arrogance implies overvaluation, and the other Ernesto didn't seem to overvalue anything, but rather the specific calm of someone who doesn't have to justify himself to anyone, who made his own mistakes, and it inhabits them with ease. The real Ernesto had never known. Because that was the central point. The point nobody explains. When you choose to stay in a safe place, you don't escape mistakes. That's a completely false illusion. You only trade one set of mistakes for another. The brave man's mistakes are loud and visible, and sometimes epic, and sometimes mortifying, and always recognizable as his own. The coward's mistakes are quiet and domestic and shaped like things that never happened, and that makes them harder to see and harder still to forgive. "Were you happy?" Ernesto finally asked, and the question came out with more urgency than he'd intended, almost with the aggressiveness of someone who desperately needs the answer to be no, who needs the road not taken to have had its own miseries, to distribute the weight more fairly. The other, Ernesto, smiled slightly, not with condescension, with something closer to recognition of a question he had asked himself. "That's the wrong question," he said. "It's always the wrong question. Happiness isn't what separates our lives. We both had good afternoons and bad ones. Mornings when the world seemed possible, and nights when it seemed entirely the opposite. We both woke up sometimes with that gray, nameless weight that isn't quite sadness, but feels more like the exhaustion of existing. We both wanted things we didn't have. Happiness isn't the difference." "Then what is?" The other, Ernesto, paused before answering, not like someone who doesn't know, but like someone who wants to say something precisely, and precision takes time. "The difference is that I arrived at my bad days having chosen the path. My failures are mine. My losses are mine. Even my loneliness, when primera ade. It was a loneliness I chose or accepted with my eyes open. Yours," he said, and here the voice became softer but no gentler, more careful but no less honest. "Yours always has a question inside it, with no answer. The pain of regret isn't the pain of having lost something. It's the pain of not knowing whether you would have lost it. It's the wound that never heals, because it never had the chance to. To heal, it would need to know how the story ended. And the story never began." Ernesto heard all of this. He had it in the notebook. Because all of that, he was writing down every word, every turn of the conversation, as if his hand knew more than his head and was transcribing something that had been ready for years and had only needed the right paper, the right night, the right rain as background noise. The rain continued. 11:15. The apartment completely quiet except for the pen against paper and the rain, and very distantly the traffic of the city that never quite fell silent, that always kept that residual murmur of engines and voices, reminding Ernesto that outside there were millions of people living their lives with varying degrees of courage and varying degrees of fear, and not one of them was thinking about him. "And Valentina," he wrote finally. "What happened with Valentina in your version?" The other Ernesto didn't respond immediately, and that silence Ernesto was constructing for himself in the notebook, said more than any answer could. "That," he finally wrote, "is for the next letter." Ernesto closed the notebook at 11:42 at night. He knew because he looked at the kitchen clock when he got up to get water. That round wall clock that always ran 2 minutes fast, because he'd never reset it after the last time change. He held the glass of water in front of the window and looked at the street below, shining and empty in the rain that was still falling but slower now, with less conviction, like something that has already said what it needed to say and continues only out of momentum. Nothing had changed. That was the first thing he thought, and he thought it with a kind of relief and a kind of disappointment at the same time, because part of him had hoped that the act of writing would produce some visible transformation, some rearrangement of things, some sign that something had begun. But the apartment was the same. The squeaking chair was the same. The clock ran 2 minutes fast as always. Ernesto was the same 37-year-old man with the same job he hadn't chosen, and the same apartment with 4 chairs for one person, and the same rain outside falling indifferently over everything. But the notebook existed now, and in the notebook existed words that hadn't existed that morning, and in those words lived, precariously, intermittently, with all the fragility of something newborn. Something Ernesto hadn't had in a long time. The sensation of being completely honest with himself, without the protective story, without the elegant name that makes cowardice presentable, without the excuse of responsibility or maturity or family circumstances. Just the truth, with its specific and uncomfortable weight, with its tendency not to fit entirely in the spaces where you try to store it. He went back to the desk. Not to write more, but simply to be near the notebook. The way you stay near something that just happened and that you don't quite know how to process yet, but you know matters. He looked at it in the darkness of the room. That dark blue cover with the bent corners. That object that had been in the drawer for who knows how long, waiting precisely for this night. There were more letters to write. He didn't know yet how many, because the versions of yourself that never existed multiply as you begin to name them. Beneath each story lies another story, and beneath that, one another still, until the exercise stops being a ledger of the past and becomes something more like an archaeology. Layer upon layer of Ernestos who never were, each one supporting the one above, each one explaining something about the next, but he'd discover that later. That night, what he knew was only this: that he had started, and that there was something strangely dangerous about having started. Not dangerous like an accident or like an illness, but dangerous like the truth when you open the door for it without thinking through the consequences. It comes in, it rearranges the furniture, it makes itself at home, and then you can't make it leave. Tomorrow, Ernesto Vidal thought, he would write the next letter, and he knew, with a certainty that was new and slightly terrifying, that this time he wouldn't be late. Chapter 2. The letter to the one who said I love you first. There is a specific kind of silence that lives between two people who want the same thing and are both waiting for the other to say it first. Ernesto knew that silence well. He had lived inside it the way some people live inside houses they never fully unpack, always with the sensation of being temporary, always with the boxers half open in the corner, always with the quiet excuse that settling in completely would make leaving harder. He had lived inside that silence with Valentina. Yes, but Valentina was Paris, and Paris was the first letter, and the first letter was already written. What he hadn't told the notebook yet, what the notebook was going to force out of him tonight whether he wanted it or not, was that the silence between two people who don't speak first isn't unique. It's a habit, and habits, unlike wounds, don't announce themselves. They simply repeat. He had been doing it his whole life. The second letter began not with a memory, but with a smell. That's how certain truths arrive. Not through the front door of reasoning, but through the side entrance of the senses. Uninvited, carrying everything attached to them like luggage that wasn't checked in properly. The smell was coffee mixed with something slightly floral. The specific combination that belonged to a Tuesday morning in a small office in the accounting department of a mid-sized logistics company where Ernesto had worked for 6 years without ever learning to love it, which is a long time to spend anywhere without love. The smell belonged to Elena. Elena Marsh. He wrote the name in the notebook slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who hasn't said a word out loud in a long time and wants to make sure it still exists. It did. The name was still there, still whole, still carrying everything it used to carry, which was considerable, and which Ernesto had spent the better part of 4 years, carefully not thinking about, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has made not thinking into a quiet art form. He was 29 when he met her. She was 31. Those 2 years mattered and didn't matter. The way ages matter and don't matter when everything else between two people has a stronger gravitational pull. The logistics company was called Meridian Solutions, which was the kind of name that tried hard to sound like it meant something, and succeeded mostly at sounding like it was trying. It occupied 3 floors of a glass building on the east side of the city, the kind of building that looks impressive from the outside and aggressively ordinary from the inside. All fluorescent lights and cubicle dividers in shades of gray that some designer had probably called Slayton, pewter in the proposal in which in practice looked exactly like what they were. The colors of a place where ambition comes to negotiate a truce with practicality. Ernesto had gotten the job through a friend of a friend, which is how he got most things in his life sideways, indirectly, through connections that required no particular initiative on his part. The position was in document management, which meant he spent his days organizing, classifying, and routing information that mattered to other people in ways he never fully understood and never particularly tried to. He was good at it, which was the problem. Being good at something you didn't choose and don't love is one of the more insidious traps life sets for certain types of people. The careful ones, the ones who do things thoroughly out of habit rather than passion. Because competence creates its own momentum, its own justifications, its own invisible walls that look like stability from the inside, and like a cage from any other angle. He had been there for 3 years when Elena joined the accounting team. He noticed her on her first day, which wasn't remarkable in itself. One notices new people in contained environments the way you notice a new piece of furniture in a familiar room, because the familiarity of everything else makes the different thing visible almost automatically. What was remarkable was what he noticed. Not her appearance first, though she was striking in a way that took a moment to fully register, the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself loudly but accumulates quietly until suddenly you realize you've been looking for a while. What he noticed first was the way she argued. It was a Tuesday morning and there was a team meeting in the second-floor conference room. One of those meetings that exists primarily to confirm that the meeting the previous week produced results that would be better examined in the following week's meeting. The kind of organizational recursion that Ernesto had long since stopped questioning. The head of accounting was explaining a new filing protocol with a subdued enthusiasm of someone presenting something they know is boring but feel professionally obligated to make sound important. And Elena, sitting across the table and 3 seats to the left, raised her hand and said, simply and without any detectable nervousness, "I think that creates more steps without solving the actual problem." The room had one of those brief silences that conference rooms produce when someone says something true that wasn't on the agenda. The head of accounting said, "Well, let's take that offline," which is corporate language for "I hear you and intend to do nothing about it," and moved on. Elena wrote something in her notepad, probably the thing she'd just said, Ernesto thought, so she'd remember it wasn't resolved, and looked back at the presentation with an expression of patient, clear-eyed skepticism that Ernesto found immediately and completely fascinating. After the meeting, he introduced himself in the hallway. This was notable for anyone keeping track of Ernesto Vidal's patterns of behavior, because Ernesto did not typically introduce himself to people in hallways. He waited to be introduced. He waited to be placed in proximity by circumstance or by the social maneuvering of others, and then allowed conversation to happen to him rather than initiating it himself. But that morning, for reasons he couldn't articulate then and could only partially articulate now, something overrode the usual protocol. He walked up to her while she was pouring coffee in the break room. That coffee that smelled of itself and something faintly floral. He would later realize it was her hand lotion, and said, "You were right, by the way, about the filing system." Elena looked at him for a moment with the direct, assessing quality that he would come to recognize as simply the way she looked at things. Not aggressive, not challenging, just present. Just fully there in the moment of looking in a way that made you feel both seen and slightly examined. Then she smiled, not widely. "Just enough, I know," she said. "That's why it's frustrating." And that was the beginning of it. What followed was 6 months of something that had no official name, and therefore no official existence, which suited Ernesto perfectly. They had lunch together 2 or 3 times a week in the cafeteria on the first floor, or when the weather allowed, on the small concrete plaza outside the building where 2 benches faced a planter box with a shrub that never seemed to grow or die but simply persisted. They talked about everything except what they were. They talked about books Elena read obsessively, mostly non-fiction, history and biography. With fiction as a counterpoint, she said she needed the way you need salt. Without it, everything else is technically fine, but something essential is missing. They talked about the city, which she'd moved to 18 months earlier from a smaller town in the Pacific Northwest, a place she described with affectionate ambivalence, the way people talk about childhoods that were mostly good but too small for who they became. They talked about their families, carefully at first, and then less carefully. The way conversations about family always start at the periphery and spiral inward if the trust is there. She had a younger brother with whom she was close, a father who called every Sunday and talked primarily about sports. In a way she found endearing rather than frustrating because she'd learned to hear the love underneath the sports reports, and a mother who had died 4 years earlier from a cancer that had been brief and terrible. The kind that doesn't give anyone time to arrange their feelings in the right order before it's over. She mentioned her mother the way people mention things that have restructured everything about them. Matter-of-factly, as a fact of the landscape rather than a wound, but with a particular quality of weight in the words. As if each mention cost something small and she decided it was worth it. Ernesto told her things he hadn't told most people. Not because he made a conscious decision to open up. He was constitutionally distant. 2 grand emotional gestures even in conversation. But because Elena had the specific quality of making you feel that honesty was the most natural response. She didn't push. She didn't probe or use the therapeutic techniques of strategic silence that his previous therapist had favored. She simply responded to things as if they were worth responding to, which is rarer than it sounds, and which created in Ernesto the unusual sensation of being in a conversation where his words had weight. He was, of course, falling in love with her. He knew it at around the 4-month mark, with that same crystalline, inconvenient clarity with which he had known it with Valentina. The difference was that this time the clarity came with an additional component that Valentina hadn't quite produced. Urgency. With Valentina there had been the comfortable cushion of youth, the sense that time was abundant and decisions could be delayed because there was always more of the same ahead. With Elena, he was 29 going on 30, and for the first time in his life he felt the specific weight of time as a finite resource, not heavily, not with panic, but with the persistent low-grade awareness of someone who has started to understand, intellectually, that not everything can be indefinitely postponed. He almost said something 4 times. That's worth being precise about, because imprecision would let him over easily. For specific moments in which everything aligned: the context, the emotion, the opening, and he felt the words forming and chose, each time, to let them dissolve back into silence. The first time was on a Thursday evening in November when they stayed late in the office finishing a project nobody else cared about and went for a drink afterward. At the bar 2 blocks from the building, and she laughed at something he said with her whole face, completely unself-consciously, and for a moment in the warm amber light of that bar he felt the sentence, "I think I'm in love with you," sitting right at the edge of his voice, and swallowed it. The second time was at a holiday party in December, standing near the window with their drinks while the rest of the office generated noise and bad dancing around them, and she said quietly, almost to herself, "I never know what to do with these things." And Ernesto said, "Neither do I." And they stood there in their shared quiet amid the noise, and it felt like something. It felt exactly like something. And he said nothing. The third time was in February, when she had a bad week. A difficult situation with a project that had gone wrong through no fault of hers. And she sat with him at lunch, and didn't talk much, and he sat with her in the not talking. In a way that felt more intimate than most conversations he'd had, and she said at the end, looking up from her coffee, "Thanks for just being here." And he said, "Of course," and inside him the whole architecture of what he felt was right there, right at the surface, and he let it pass. The fourth time was the one that cost the most, and it happened on a Saturday in March. They had gotten into the habit, over the winter, of occasional weekend excursions that were never called dates and never officially weren't. The ambiguity was, Ernesto understood this, even then, in T-moment, with a self-awareness that made the behavior more damnable rather than less. The ambiguity was his doing. He maintained it deliberately, not with manipulation but with omission, which is its own kind of manipulation. The kind that allows you to feel innocent while engineering the outcome you want, which in Ernesto's case was always the outcome in which nothing was risked. That Saturday in March, they went to an art museum on the north side of the city. It was the kind of museum that takes itself seriously in the right way. Not pretentiously, not with the cold austerity of spaces that want you to feel uncultured for breathing, but with genuine conviction that what's on the walls matters, and that the people walking past it deserve to be treated as capable of mattering back. They moved through the galleries at different speeds, which was something Ernesto found he liked. The way she moved ahead to a painting that caught her and he caught up, and sometimes it was the reverse, and neither of them felt the need to stay synchronized. It felt like a conversation happening in 2 registers simultaneously. They ended up in a room with a large canvas abstract, mostly blues and greens, with a vertical slash of something almost orange, and stood in front of it for longer than either of them had planned. Elena had her arms crossed, her head slightly tilted, the expression she wore when she was thinking past the surface of something. "What do you see?" she asked. Not as a test, as a genuine question. Ernesto looked at the painting. He looked at it for a real moment. Not the performative moment of museum going where you stand in front of art for the socially appropriate duration before moving on, but an actual moment of looking, someone who wanted to go somewhere, he said finally, and couldn't decide which direction. Elena turned to look at him. Not at the painting, at him, and held the look for a beat too long, in that way that is always a beat too long for accidental eye contact, but exactly right for something else. "That's not what I see," she said. "What do you see?" "Someone who already decided," she said, "and is trying to convince themselves they haven't." The room was quiet around them, not empty. There were 2 other visitors somewhere behind them, but quiet in the specific way that certain spaces produce. A hush that feels like an invitation rather than an absence. Ernesto looked back at the painting, then back at her, and he felt, with absolute clarity, that the moment was right there, that this was it, that the painting and the light and the question she had answered and the way she was still looking at him had assembled themselves into the most articulate possible invitation, and that all he had to do All he had ever had to do was step into it. He looked back at the painting. "That's a better read than mine," he said. Elena held her expression for one more moment, patient, open, unhurried, giving him every possible additional second, and then nodded slightly and turned back to the canvas. "Maybe," she said, and that was all. They had lunch afterward at a restaurant near the museum, and the conversation was good, genuinely good, full of the ease and sharpness that had made their Tuesday lunches at the office something. Ernesto had started to structure his week around without fully admitting it, but something had shifted, invisibly, in that gallery. Some door had been gently, quietly, and without drama closed. Not locked, not sealed, just eased shut by the momentum of what didn't happen. The way doors close when the pressure on one side simply releases. She started seeing someone in April. Ernesto found out the way you find out things in offices obliquely, through the accumulation of small evidence, a mention of weekend plans that had a different quality than usual, a slight shift in the rhythm of her availability. And finally, the direct confirmation from a colleague who mentioned it without guile because there was no reason for guile. It was simply news. His name was David. He worked in urban planning. He was, by all accounts, good. Ernesto took this with the surface composure that he was very practiced at deploying and went home that evening and sat in his kitchen for a long time without eating dinner, which was the most dramatic external expression his internal life ever produced. A skipped meal, the lights not turned on, the city noise coming through the window while he sat in the darkening room and processed, belatedly, the thing he had been declining to process for 6 months. She hadn't moved on. That wasn't it. She had simply moved. There was a difference, and the difference was important. Moving on implies a before and after, a thing that was and then stopped being. Elena hadn't had a thing to move on from, because Ernesto had made sure of that. What she had done was move forward in the direction that forward was available, the direction that someone had offered and she had accepted because she was someone who accepted real things over imaginary ones, who chose the available door over the hypothetical one. David was an available door. Ernesto had not been, by design. With full authorship. The lunch schedule changed naturally after that, not dramatically, not with visible awkwardness. Elena wasn't the kind of person who required drama to make transitions. She moved from one state of things to another with the same clear-eyed pragmatism she brought to the filing system meeting. But it changed. The way things change when an unspoken context shifts, and the activities built on that context no longer quite make sense in the same form. They remained friendly, they remained collegial and genuinely warm, and there was nothing false in that warmth, because what they'd had was real, even if it had been, on his side, deliberately incomplete. But the Tuesday lunches became less frequent, and then occasional. And then the kind of thing that happens when circumstances align rather than the thing you construct around because your week feels diminished without it. Ernesto stayed at Meridian Solutions for 3 more years after that. Elena was there for 2 of them before she left for a better position somewhere on the other side of the city. They said goodbye the way professional relationships end when they've been good. With genuine warmth, with the kind of hug that says this mattered without specifying the exact nature of the mattering. With the exchange of contact information both parties know they probably won't use and file in their phones under names that will appear years later and scroll through moments and produce a brief, clean ache. He had texted her once, about a year after she left. Something small. A news article about something they'd once talked about. The kind of message that is technically about the article and is actually about keeping a thread open. She responded warmly, with characteristic brevity and wit, and that was that. A thread capped, leading nowhere particular, which was perhaps appropriate. Now, in the blue notebook, in the apartment, with the rain still making its case against the windows, Ernesto wrote to the version of himself who had said it, who had turned from the painting in that gallery and looked at Elena and said, simply and without armor, "I think I'm in love with you. I've been thinking about how to not say it for 6 months, and I'm tired of not saying it." He wrote the letter slowly, with care, building that other Ernesto word by word the way you build something you want to be sturdy. "I don't know what she said," he wrote. "I never will." Maybe she said it back. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was surprised and needed time. Maybe she said something that would have broken everything, and maybe that breaking would have been its own kind of necessary. Maybe it would have been a disaster, but it would have been a real disaster. Loud, embarrassing. Something that happened instead of something that didn't. And there's a dignity in real disasters that quiet omissions never have. The painting is still in my head, he wrote. The blues and the greens and that vertical slash of orange. I still don't fully know what it meant, but she was right. Someone had already decided. The painting was about someone who had already decided and was performing the deliberation after the fact. That's what I've always done, decided in secret and then pretended to still be considering, as if the decision being private protected me from it, as if a door closed on the inside still counts as not closed. He stopped writing and looked up at the dark ceiling of the apartment. The rain had gentled further, down to a murmur now, the kind of rain that isn't going anywhere but has stopped making demands. There was something he hadn't written yet, something that had been sitting at the edge of the letter since he started it. He picked the pen back up. The thing I haven't admitted until now, he wrote. He started new. I knew in the gallery. I knew in November at the bar, and in December at the party, and in February at lunch, and especially in the gallery in March. I knew that she was there. Not maybe, not I think, not reading this. I knew with the certainty of someone who has spent 4 months learning to read a specific person and has gotten very good at it. I knew she was there, and I looked back at the painting anyway. And the reason I looked back at the painting, the reason I have spent my whole life looking back at the painting, is not because I didn't know what was on the other side. It's because I did know, and knowing made it worse. Knowing made it real, and real things can fail in ways that imaginary things never can. That's the thing you understood that I didn't. Not bravery, exactly. Not some special reserves of courage I lacked. Just the ability to tolerate real failure over imaginary safety. Just the decision made once, and then made again. And then made again, that a real life, even a painful one, is worth more than a perfect one that only exists in the space between what you wanted and what you said. He set the pen down. His hand was slightly cramped from writing. The good kind of cramp. The kind that means something was produced. He opened and closed his fist slowly, looking at the notebook on the desk. The conversation with the other Ernesto, when it came, was quieter than the first. Not because there was less to say, but because both of them, the one who had spoken and the one who hadn't, were tired in the way that honesty makes you tired when it's been stored too long. Tired with a quality that wasn't unpleasant, the way your legs are tired after a long walk that was worth taking. Did she love you? Ernesto asked the other Ernesto. The other one took his time. She was interested, he said finally. Whether it would have become love, I don't know. Love isn't a thing that exists in advance of the time it takes to grow. It's not a capacity waiting to be confirmed. It's a thing that happens or doesn't happen in the specific context of two people who give it room. You and I will never know if it would have happened, because you didn't give it room, and I. He paused, and there was something in the pause that was neither regret nor satisfaction, but something more honest than both. I gave it room, and it grew into something, and then it changed. And that change was its own kind of education. Was it enough? It was real, the other Ernesto said. Real was enough. There's a line from a writer Ernesto had read in college. He couldn't remember who now. One of those readings that lodges in the memory without its attribution, like a song you know every word of but can't name. That said something about how the unlived life accumulates interest. He hadn't understood it at 22. He thought he understood it now, at 37. In the way that you understand things when they've stopped being abstract and started being personal. The unlived life accumulates interest. It compounds. Every year of not saying the thing adds to the principle of the unsaid. Every year of looking back at the painting, instead of turning toward the person, raises the stakes of the next painting, the next person, the next moment in which everything aligns and the sentence sits at the edge of your voice. He had been accumulating interest his whole adult life, and now, at 37, the balance was considerable. He wrote one last thing in the letter before closing the notebook. Not to the other Ernesto. To himself. Or maybe there was no longer a meaningful distinction. The bravest thing I can think of, he wrote, is not the grand gesture, not the airport dash or the rain-soaked confession or any of the things the movies have convinced us constitute courage in love. The bravest thing I can think of is saying the ordinary sentence in the ordinary moment without waiting for conditions to be perfect, without waiting for certainty, without building a case first. Just, here is what is true for me right now. Just, I'm telling you, here's not telling you costs more than I want to keep paying. Just, here. That sentence. That's the one I never said. That's the one you said. He closed the notebook. The rain had stopped. Not gradually, not with a slow fading, but with the abruptness of things that end decisively there one moment and then, between 1 second and the next, completely gone. The city absorbed the silence with its usual efficiency, already filling it with other sounds, other urgencies, other lives proceeding at their own pace, with their own unopened letters and unspoken sentences and paintings, looked back at instead of people. Ernesto sat in the chirping chair for a long time without moving. He was thinking about the third letter. Not because he wanted to think about it, because there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came with these excavations, a tiredness that was productive and necessary, but that the body registered honestly regardless. But because the third letter was already forming itself without his permission, the way the first had, the way the second had, the way things form when you've opened a door and the things behind it have been waiting long enough that they don't need an invitation anymore. They simply come. He knew what the third letter was about. He'd known since the moment he found the notebook. He just wasn't ready yet. Tomorrow, he thought. He would be ready tomorrow. And then, with the particular tired honesty that the night had produced in him, he corrected himself. Maybe tomorrow, or maybe I'll find a reason to wait. That's the thing about me. I always find a reason to wait. He looked at the notebook. Not this time, he thought, and wasn't entirely sure he believed it, and decided that not being entirely sure was probably the most honest place to start. Chapter 3. The letter to the one who quit. There is a particular kind of man who is very good at explaining why he stayed. He has the arguments ready, preloaded, available in multiple formats depending on the audience. The practical version for family, the philosophical version for himself at 2 in the morning, the self-deprecating but ultimately affirming version for casual conversations at parties. The arguments are always reasonable. They are always internally consistent. They are always, when examined closely enough, completely beside the point. Ernesto Vidal was that kind of man. And the third letter, which he had known since the first night was coming, which he had been circling for 2 evenings with the cautious orbit of someone who knows the thing at the center is hot, was the letter that went straight to the point he had spent 12 years constructing arguments to avoid. He had been 35 when he had the letter of resignation in his hand. He was 37 now. The letter had never been sent. It still existed. Technically, he knew exactly which drawer it was in the same desk that had produced the blue notebook, 2 drawers up, folded in thirds inside a manila envelope, with nothing written on the outside. He had never thrown it away. He had never sent it. He had kept it in that intermediate state, that limbo of the unmailed, for 2 years, and the fact that he had kept it, that he hadn't destroyed it, was perhaps the most honest thing about him. The one confession his practical, careful, argument-ready self hadn't been able to suppress entirely. He opened the notebook. He wrote at the top of the page, without preamble, "To you, who put the envelope in the outbox instead of back in the drawer." Then he stopped and looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he opened the drawer 2 up from the bottom. The envelope was there. He set it on the desk beside the notebook and didn't open it. He didn't need to open it. He remembered every word. He had written it in a single hour on a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesdays again. Always Tuesdays. As if that particular day of the week had been assigned to his life's most consequential moments by some clerical error in the universe. And it was the best thing he had written since the scholarship application at 22, which was either a damning indictment of the 13 years between them or simply a fact about what happens when you write from a place of complete and unguarded honesty. Outside, the night was clear for the first time in days. No rain. The absence of rain produced its own sound. A different quality of quiet that Ernesto found almost disorienting after the last several evenings, with the water against the glass as backdrop. The city was audible in a different register, sharper, more specific, Individual sounds detaching from the general mass. A car, a voice, something metal somewhere. The intermittent suggestion of music from a floor above. He began to write. Marcos Delgado had been Ernesto's closest friend since they were both 24 and working their first real jobs in adjacent offices in the same building in the financial district. Ernesto at what was then his second year at Meridian Solutions. Marcos at an insurance consulting firm 2 floors down that specialized in liability coverage for mid-sized construction companies, which was either the most boring possible job description or the most accidentally poetic one, depending on your philosophical orientation toward liability. They had met in the elevator on a Monday morning in the deadest week of January. The week after the holidays, when the world returns to itself with a kind of collective reluctant drag, and the fluorescent lights of every office in every city seem slightly more fluorescent than they did in December, as if the absence of holiday decoration reveals just how much work the decoration was doing. Marcos had been carrying a coffee in each hand and a folder clamped under his left arm in a configuration that was clearly unstable and clearly about to fail. And Ernesto had reached out and taken the folder without being asked, which was not the kind of spontaneous, helpful thing Ernesto typically did. But the folder was going to fall, and the impulse arrived before the hesitation could. "Thanks," Marcos had said, with the directness of someone who accepts help without making it complicated. "I always do this. I always think I can carry more than I can." "Most people do," Ernesto had said. "Most people learn," Marcos had said, and smiled. And that was more or less the whole of their origin story. A folder, an elevator, 2 men who had not yet learned what they would eventually learn in different directions about the limits of what they could carry. They had become friends with the gradual, unforced naturalness of people whose rhythms are compatible, who occupy the world at similar speeds, who find silence together as easy as conversation, who can share a meal without requiring that the meal be an event. They had lunch together 2 or 3 times a week, rotating between the 3 or 4 establishments, within reasonable walking distance of the building that had gradually been sorted into categories based on purpose. The Thai place for when someone needed to complain about something and wanted enough noise around them to feel private. The sandwich shop for ordinary Tuesdays. The Italian place for celebrations, or the need to approximate celebration. And the coffee place at the end of the block, for the conversations that weren't quite lunch-worthy, but needed more time and privacy than the office allowed. What made the friendship valuable? What made it the kind of friendship that Ernesto could count on one hand? The number of times he'd had in his life was not similarity, but complementarity. They were different in almost every way that mattered. Marcos was loud in the way that warm people are loud, expansive, physically present, the kind of man who filled the room not with ego but with energy, who remembered the names of waitstaff, and followed up on things people mentioned in passing weeks earlier and laughed with his whole body and had opinions about everything from geopolitics to the correct ratio of cream cheese. Ernesto was quieter, more interior, more likely to have the perfect response to a conversation 3 hours after it ended than in the moment. Where Marcos moved toward things, Ernesto observed them first. Where Marcos decided quickly and adjusted later, Ernesto adjusted preemptively and then was paralyzed by the adjustments. And yet they understood each other in the specific way that certain different people do not, in spite of the difference, but through it. Each one illuminating something in the other's blind spot, precisely because the blind spot was not shared. Marcos was the one who, over many lunches and many years, had watched Ernesto's relationship with his work, with the patient. Affectionate exasperation of someone watching a person they care about make a recurring choice they can see as wrong but which they have no authority to override. He never pushed. That was one of the things about Marcos. He was opinionated about his own life with a confidence that bordered on the spectacular. But he had a curious restraint about other people's choices, a respect for autonomy that coexisted with his general volubility without apparent contradiction. He stated his observations once, clearly, and then stepped back. What you did with them was yours. He had made his observation about Ernesto and the job in year 4 of their friendship. They were at the Thai place. Complaint, whether something about a project that had gone sideways, and Marcos had listened to the whole thing and then said, with the casual precision of someone delivering a thing he'd been thinking for a while, "You know what I notice? You never complain about the work being hard. You complain about it being pointless. That's a different problem." Ernesto had said, "I mean, sure, a lot of jobs are pointless," and Marcos had let it go. as he always did, and they had moved on to something else, and the observation had gone into that same category as most true things Ernesto received. Filed under acknowledged, acted upon never. Marcos quit his job in the 4th year of their friendship, on a Thursday in early spring, with the calculation that Ernesto witnessed in fragments over several lunches, in the weeks before it happened, in which he found simultaneously admirable and incomprehensible. The calculation wasn't reckless. That was the thing that made it impossible for Ernesto to dismiss it as impulse, which was his preferred method of managing other people's courage, to locate the irrationality in it, and use that as the reason it didn't apply to him. Marcos had saved for 18 months. He had identified 3 realistic alternative directions: a small business he'd been thinking about for 2 years, a graduate program he'd researched thoroughly, freelance consulting as a bridge option, and he had examined each one, not with the dreamy vagueness of wishful thinking, but with the same actuarial precision he'd spent 4 years applying to liability assessments. He knew his runway. He knew his minimum viable outcome. He had a plan and 2 contingencies, and then he had done it. Walked into his manager's office on a Thursday and handed over the letter and come down to the sandwich shop at noon to tell Ernesto, who had been waiting for the update with an anxiety he recognized as disproportionate but couldn't fully account for. Done, Marcos had said, sitting down across from him with a smile that was quieter than his usual ones. Not smaller, but quieter, like something lit from inside rather than from outside. "How do you feel?" Ernesto had asked. Marcos had thought about it for a real moment. "Terrified," he said. "And also like I gave myself back something I didn't realize I'd lent out." Ernesto had nodded. He had said something supportive and genuine, because he was genuinely supportive of Marcos, completely and without reservation. And under the support, under the warmth and the real happiness for his friend, something else moved, something he identified in the moment as admiration and which he understood only later, much later, was recognition. The terror Marcos described. The sensation of having lent yourself out. He knew both of those things. He had simply never handed in the letter. The business Marcos started was small and, in the first year, precarious in the way that honest ventures often are. He converted a van into a mobile workshop and offered custom woodworking to order furniture, cabinetry, built-ins, the kind of work that required skill and patience and a tolerance for the specific satisfaction of making something with your hands that exists in the world after you're done with it. The first year was lean. There were months where the numbers were not comfortable, where Marcos ate into the runway he'd calculated with the seriousness of someone who had planned for this without wanting to need the plan. He worked longer hours than he had at the insurance firm, with less certainty and more physical exhaustion, and no guarantee that the following month would be better. He was, by his own account, and by Ernesto's observation over their continuing lunches, more alive. That word was the problem. Alive is an unfair word, because it implies that the alternative is the opposite. And that's not quite right. Ernesto was not alive, was not numb or depressed or empty in any clinical sense. But there was a quality in Marcos that was difficult to look at directly without producing an uncomfortable secondary effect. The way certain kinds of light are difficult to look at directly, it was the quality of someone fully installed in their own existence, inhabiting their own days without the ambient sense of being somewhere temporary. Ernesto, sitting across from him at the sandwich shop or the Thai place or the Italian place, found himself studying that quality with the attention of a researcher, and the longing of someone who has seen a thing and understood, immediately, that they wanted and are not currently in possession of it. "Doesn't it scare you?" Ernesto asked him about 8 months in, on a rainy Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday, when the month had apparently been a difficult one. "Every day," Marcos said, without hesitation and without complaint, as a simple statement of fact. "But it's my scary. You know what I mean? The fear belongs to me. I chose the thing that's making me afraid. That's different from being afraid of something you've stumbled into." Ernesto knew what he meant. He had understood it in the moment, with a clarity that landed somewhere between the sternum and the throat. That specific location in the body where truths arrive when they're inconvenient. He had understood it and then done what he always did with things he understood at inconvenient depths. He had filed it, and gone back to the office, and organized the documents that needed organizing, and been competent and thorough and quietly and visibly structurally miserable in a way he'd gotten so good at managing that he'd almost stopped noticing it was misery. Almost. The resignation letter had grown from a long period of almost noticing. It had been preceded by a year of small accumulations, not dramatic moments, not crises, not the kind of breaking point that makes for a good story, but the slow sediment of days in which the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be became incrementally less. The meeting that lasted an hour to produce a decision that could have been made in an email. The project he completed thoroughly and well and which produced in him, upon completion, nothing. The morning he sat in the parking structure for 11 minutes before going in. Not because he was on the phone or finishing a thought, but simply because he needed 11 minutes before he could make himself get out of the car. The lunch with Marcos on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday this time. The universe occasionally varied its delivery system when Marcos talked about a piece he was building. A dining table for a family in the suburbs, and described the grain of the wood with a specificity and a tenderness that made Ernesto suddenly, and without warning, feel something in his chest that he had to manage carefully for the rest of the meal. He had written the letter on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 2 years ago. He had written it in 1 hour, at his desk, during the lunch break, when the floor was mostly empty. With the door to his small office closed and the only sound the hum of the building's HVAC system doing its indifferent work, he wrote it in the voice of someone who had been composing it in their head for considerably longer than an hour, which was accurate. The actual writing was more like transcription, like finally putting down what had been circulating. It was not an angry letter. That was the thing about it that surprised him when he reread it later. It wasn't angry at all, not at the company or the work or the people, none of whom had done anything wrong except occupy a place in his life that he had abdicated the responsibility to fill himself. It was simply true. It said that he had been there for 9 years and that he was grateful for what the job had given him, which was real. It had given him stability and routine and a context for competence, all of which had served genuine purposes in their time. And it said that he had come to understand, slowly and with some difficulty, that stability and competence are not the same thing as a life you chose, and that at 35 he had decided he couldn't continue to confuse them. That was all. 1 page. Clear, honest, specific, the best professional writing he had ever done, which was perhaps appropriate given that it was the only professional writing that had cost him anything to produce. He had put it in a manila envelope. He had held the envelope in his hand for 3 minutes. He had put it in the top right drawer of his desk, which was the drawer closest to his outbox, and which he had chosen deliberately, as if proximity to the outbox were a form of commitment, as if keeping it near the place where things get sent were different from keeping it in the filing cabinet at the back of the room. It was not different. The letter sat in the drawer for 2 years, getting no closer to the outbox, by millimeters or by days. Ernesto wrote all of this in the blue notebook with the slow, uncomfortable honesty of a surgeon describing their own procedure. He did not spare himself. The 11 minutes in the parking garage, the grain of the wood, the 3 minutes holding the envelope, all of it went in, because the notebook had established from the first night that it was not a place for the edited version. The notebook was the unedited version, the one that existed before the story became something presentable, before the narrative got its name. Then he wrote the letter itself. To you, who put it in the outbox. I've been trying to imagine what that moment was like. Not what came after. I'll get there. But the moment itself, the 3 minutes I stood holding the envelope and then put it back in the drawer. Were they 3 minutes of something different for you? Did you feel something I didn't? Did the certainty arrive differently, with more force? Or was it the same ambivalence I felt, and you simply moved through it, rather than letting it stop you? I think it was the same ambivalence. I think that's the thing I got wrong for the longest time. I thought the people who acted were the people who were certain. That bravery was the absence of doubt, and I was waiting for the doubt to resolve before I moved. But it doesn't resolve. I understand that now. The doubt is structural. The doubt is part of the architecture of any real decision. Not a defect to be corrected before the decision becomes valid. You put the letter in the outbox with the same doubt I put it back in the drawer with. The difference was not the doubt. The difference was the direction you moved in despite it. He stopped writing. He picked up the manila envelope from the desk. He held it, not for 3 minutes this time, for longer. He turned it over in his hands and felt the slight rigidity of the paper inside. That single folded page with its one honest hour's work. He did not open it, but he did not put it back in the drawer either. He set it on the desk, in the open, where he could see it. Then he kept writing. What I want to know is this. Was it better? Not was it easier or safer or more comfortable. Those questions I already know the answers to, because Marcos answers them every week in the simple fact of how he occupies a room. And the answer is not simple and not always comfortable and sometimes considerably more difficult than staying would have been. But was it better in the way that matters? Was it yours? I know that's the question you can't answer for me. I know you can tell me it was hard and you can tell me it was real and you can tell me that real is worth more than comfortable in the long accounting of a life. And I know all of that. I've known all of that for 2 years. The letter has been in the drawer for 2 years and I've known. The knowing isn't the problem. The problem is the moment between knowing and moving. That gap. That specific geography between understanding a thing completely and doing the thing you understand. I have lived my entire adult life in that gap. I've set up residence there. I have furnished it. I know every corner of it. And the question I'm asking you, the only question I'm actually asking is, how wide was the gap for you? Because from here it looks like a chasm, and I want to know if it looked the same from your side, before you crossed it. He wrote that and stopped and felt something release in his chest. Not dramatically, not with the quality of revelation, but with the quieter quality of a pressure, as if the question, honest, specific, undecorated, had been doing work just by being asked, just by being moved from the interior where it had been pressurizing for 2 years to the page where it could be looked at. The other Ernesto arrived in the usual way, not suddenly but gradually, the way a person becomes visible in dim light, first as a general presence and then with increasing specificity. He sat in the dining chair, the empty one, the one that had become his chair over the last several evenings. He looked tired, not in the way of someone who had had a bad week, but in the way of someone who has worked hard at something real for a sustained period of time and carries that work in the body the way physical labor is carried, not unpleasantly, but perceptibly. Ernesto looked at him for a moment before writing anything. He noticed the hands. The other Ernesto's hands were different. He was sure of it. Or maybe it was the same hands and the difference was in how they were held. Slightly rougher, less carefully positioned. The hands of someone who uses them for things. The gap, the other Ernesto said, was exactly as wide as it looked. Ernesto wrote that down. I'm not going to tell you it was easy, the other continued, or that the certainty arrived and made it simple. It didn't. I stood in the same parking garage you stood in. I had the same 11 minutes. I had the envelope in the drawer for 6 weeks before I sent it. Not 2 years, but 6 weeks. And those 6 weeks were not comfortable. Then what happened? The other Ernesto took his time. Marcos happened, he said finally. Not in a dramatic way. He didn't say anything I hadn't already heard. We were at the Italian place. The good one, not the one by the sandwich shop. And he was talking about a commission he'd just finished. And he said something offhand. Something he wasn't even particularly focused on. He said, the thing about making something is that when you're done, it's there. It exists. You can point at it and say, that's the thing I made. And then he went back to his pasta. That's it. That's Italiano. Because I realized, sitting there, that in 9 years at Meridian I had never once made a thing I could point at. I had maintained things. I had managed things. I had processed and organized and rooted. All useful. All competent. All completely invisible in the final accounting of what I had produced with the hours of my life. I went back to the office after lunch and took the envelope out of the drawer and put it in the outbox before I could have the conversation with myself about why I should wait. Before the conversation, Ernesto wrote, and the 2 words sat on the page with a weight that was disproportionate to their size. Before the conversation, the other confirmed, because I knew if I had the conversation I'd lose. I always lose the conversation. We both do. We're very good at the conversation. We can argue ourselves out of anything. The trick, the only trick, I think is to move before the argument starts. Ernesto put the pen down. He stood up and walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window with it the way he had on the previous nights, looking down at the empty, dry street. Dry tonight, the rain's absence making the city look different, slightly more exposed, the way things look when the thing that was softening them is gone. He thought about Marcos. He thought about the table Marcos had described, the dining table for the family in the suburbs, the grain of the wood, and tried to identify the single thing he had made in 12 years at Meridian Solutions that had a grain, a texture, a physical reality he could point to. He tried for a long time. He found nothing. He found organized information and efficient processes and a reliable performance record and a salary that had increased incrementally and appropriately, and which sustained him adequately and which represented, in the most honest possible accounting, the going rate for 12 years of his life that he had spent not choosing. He went back to the desk. He looked at the manila envelope sitting in the open, upright against the notebook, the closest it had been to anything resembling the outbox since the day he'd put it in the drawer. He didn't send it tonight. He knew that. Sending it tonight, in the heat of this excavation, in the emotional ambient of 3 consecutive evenings of excavation, would be its own kind of avoidance. The grand gesture performed as a substitute for the sustained, ordinary, daily decision that real change actually requires. The letter needed to be sent from a Tuesday morning that was not special, that had no rain and no blue notebook and no 3-hour session of existential archaeology. That was just a Tuesday, with the fluorescent lights and the HVC hum and the documents waiting to be managed. The letter needed to be sent from the most ordinary possible day in order for the sending to mean something. But he picked it up. He held it again, and this time, the 3 minutes didn't resolve in the direction of the drawer. He set it on top of the notebook, on top of the letters already written, on top of Paris and Elena and the museum and March and the rain and everything that had been excavated in the last several evenings and set out in the open air where it could be looked at, which is the necessary first step before anything can be changed. He wrote one final thing in the notebook before closing it. Not to the other Ernesto. Not to anyone specific. Just to the page. Just to the act of writing it down. Where it couldn't be taken back. Marcos made something with his hands and can point at it. I organized something with my hands, and it is indistinguishable from the next person's organization. The difference isn't talent. The difference isn't even courage. Exactly. The difference is that Marcos decided at a specific moment that the thing he made should be his. That the grain should match the hands. I have spent 12 years being competent on behalf of something that was never mine. And the letter in the manila envelope is the closest I have come to saying that out loud. To anyone who could do something about it. Tomorrow, I am going to read the letter again. In the morning, before the conversation has time to start. Just the letter. Just the morning. Just before the argument, he closed the notebook. He looked at the manila envelope on top of it. He left both of them on the desk when he went to bed. In the open, visible from the doorway, where he would see them first thing in the morning when the day was still new enough that the arguments hadn't had time to organize themselves. It wasn't sending the letter. But it wasn't putting it back in the drawer either. For Ernesto Vidal, at 37 years old, on a clear night in February, with the rain finally gone. That distance, that small, concrete, specific distance between the drawer and the desk was the closest thing to movement he had made in a very long time. And movement, even when it is small, even when it is frightened, even when it arrives 2 years and 1 blue notebook late, is still movement. That, at least, he was beginning to believe. Chapter 4. The letter to the sun. There are griefs that don't have names, because the thing that was lost never had one first. Ernesto had spent years trying to locate this particular grief in the standard taxonomy, the recognized categories, the ones society has built rituals around, the ones that come with casseroles and condolence cards, and a generally understood protocol. For how long they're supposed to last before the world expects you to reassemble yourself and continue. He had looked for it there and found nothing that fit, because the grief he carried wasn't for someone who had existed and then stopped. It was for someone who had never existed at all, and that is a different kind of weight, one that doesn't show on the outside, one that produces no visible wound, one that you can carry for years in the ordinary luggage of daily life. without anyone ever knowing it's there. Because you yourself aren't entirely sure it's real. He wasn't sure grieve was even the right word. Grief implies a before. This was something without a before. Something more like the persistent awareness of an absence. That was never an absence in the ordinary sense, because the thing absent had never been present. The philosophers probably had a term for it. Ernesto had only a sensation, which was this. On certain mornings, usually Sundays, usually in the particular quality of light that Sunday mornings produce in apartments where one person lives alone, he would make coffee and stand at the window and feel, not dramatically, but with a quiet and irrefutable consistency, that the apartment was one person short, not of company. He had managed company in various forms over the years, not of love in the broad sense, but of something specific that company and love in their general forms don't cover. A presence that is continuous and particular and irreplaceable, and that changes the shape of a life not by adding to it but by orienting it, by giving it a direction it didn't have before, a reason to be accountable to the future rather than simply managing the present. He had never called this feeling by its name. Tonight, in the blue notebook, on the fourth consecutive evening of the excavation that had begun with a utility bill and a chance finding in a bottom drawer, he was going to have to. He opened the notebook. He looked at the blank page for longer than usual. Then he picked up the pen and wrote, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the previous letters, to Nicholas, who never existed, and to me, who made sure of it. The name had not been planned. It arrived with the same authority as the first sentence of the first letter, unbidden, already formed. Apparently, having been waiting in some anteroom of his unconscious for precisely this moment, Nicholas, he hadn't consciously chosen it. And yet the moment he wrote it, he knew it was correct in the way that certain things are correct, not because they were reasoned into place, but because they simply are. The way your own face is correct in the mirror, regardless of whether you would have designed it that way. Nicholas Vidal. 8 years old. In this version, though why 8, Ernesto couldn't have explained precisely, perhaps. Because 8 is the age at which children are old enough to have opinions that surprise you and young enough that those opinions still have the freshness of a mind not yet managed by self-consciousness. Perhaps because 8 is the age Ernesto himself had been when he first understood that the world was not organized around his comfort, and had felt, for the first time, the curious mixture of loneliness and freedom that realization produces. Perhaps there was no reason at all, and the mind simply chose a number the way it chooses the details of dreams, with an internal logic that isn't accessible to interrogation. He was, in Ernesto's construction of him, a boy with dark hair that never stayed where you put it, and a habit of asking the second question when everyone else had stopped at the first. Not prodigy. Not exceptional in the ways that get noted and praised publicly, but with a quality of attention that was its own kind of gift. The kind of child who noticed the thing you hadn't, mentioned and asked about it with a directness that came not from precocity but from a genuine inability to pretend he hadn't noticed. He would have been, Ernesto thought, the kind of person who makes you honest without trying to, simply by being fully present in a way that makes dishonesty feel not wrong, but exhausting. He had his mother's hands. In this version, the details of the mother were deliberately kept peripheral. A warmth, a presence, a woman Ernesto had chosen to leave imprecise because the letter wasn't about her, and because making her precise would require him to examine a different category of failure that wasn't tonight's territory. She was there. She was good. The details of how she and Ernesto had not sustained what they'd begun were available in some other letter. Some other night. Tonight was about Nicolas. There had been 2 real moments. That's what Ernesto wrote first. Because the letter required honesty, and honesty required precision, and precision required him to say that this was not 1 failure, but 2. Not 1 moment of evasion, but 2 separate occasions on which the life that contained Nicholas had been close enough to touch. The first was at 31, with a woman named Clara. The second was at 34, with someone he still couldn't write about with complete steadiness. Someone whose name he wrote and then didn't. Someone he referred to in the letter simply as she, not out of mystification, but out of the specific tenderness that certain names require when they're handled near open wounds. Clara Reyes was a landscape architect he had met at a birthday party for a mutual friend. On a Saturday night in June, when the apartment was warm and the doors to the terrace were open, and there was the particular social ease that comes from a gathering, small enough that you're not managing the crowd, but large enough that you're not obligated to talk to the same person all night. She was standing near the bookshelves when Ernesto first noticed her, not browsing them, but looking at them. In the same way he looked at bookshelves in other people's homes with a reading quality. A slight tilt of the head, extracting information about the person from the organization. And the selection, the way you read a room. He had found this immediately recognizable, the way you recognize a habit in someone else that you'd thought was only yours. They had talked for most of the evening, migrating from the bookshelves to the terrace to the kitchen, where the good wine was eventually relocated. She was funny in the specific way that intelligent people are funny when they're relaxed, not performing, not constructing jokes, but finding the absurdity already present in things and simply pointing at it. She talked about her work with the passion that Ernesto had spent years observing in others, and filing under things I don't have. The passion of someone who had chosen a thing that was genuinely theirs and was still years in, surprised by how much it continued to give back. She designed public parks and urban green spaces, the kind of work that is invisible when it succeeds. You don't notice a well-designed park because it feels inevitable. It feels like it couldn't have been other than it is. The trees placed as if they placed themselves, the paths following the natural desire lines of human movement through space. That's the goal, she said, refilling her glass with the ease of someone comfortable in her own company. For it to feel like it was always there, like you didn't do it. That sounds like the opposite of most people's ambitions, Ernesto said. Yes, she said. I looked at him with an assessment that was warm rather than evaluative. Most people want credit. I want the thing to outlast the credit. He had been struck by that in the way you were struck by something that reorganizes a thought you'd had without knowing you had it. And he had thought, walking home that night through the warm June streets with the city doing its late-night work around him, that here was someone whose relationship to their own life was entirely different from his relationship to his, and that the difference was not one of talent or luck, but of something more fundamental and more correctable. Intention. They had dated for 14 months. It had been good, genuinely, substantially good. Not in the performative way of the early period of relationships when everything is still curated, but in the deeper and more useful way of two people whose actual rhythms are compatible, who can exist in the same space without the sustained effort that incompatibility requires. She was the first person since Valentina with whom Ernesto had felt the particular ease of not needing to manage his interior life in real time, of being able to be more or less what he was without the continuous low-grade labor of presentation. At month 12, Claudia sighed, not urgently, not as an ultimatum, but with a directness that was simply her natural mode of communication, that he had come to know and trust and occasionally find terrifying, that she was 33 and that she wanted children, and that she wanted them with someone who also wanted them, and that she wasn't sure he did, and that she needed to know. Ernesto had said, after a pause that lasted a beat too long, I think I do. Think, she said. Not cruelly, just precisely. I want to, he said, which was true, and was also not the same thing as yes. And they both understood the difference without having to spell it out, because that was the kind of conversation they were capable of. The kind where the unsaid is legible. Clara had given him time, 2 months of time, which was generous and clear, and completely unambiguous in its terms. And Ernesto had spent those 2 months in the gap he had lived in his whole life. The gap between knowing and moving, the gap between wanting a thing and being able to commit to the reality of that thing in full, with all its weight and all its permanence and all its transformation of the life you'd been living into something irrevocably different. He had circled the question with the thoroughness of someone who believes that enough examination will eventually produce certainty, and had discovered again what he always discovered. That certainty is not the product of examination. Certainty is the product of commitment, and commitment precedes certainty rather than following from it. 2 months passed. Clara had asked again, with the same directness and the same patience, and considerably less hope in her expression. And Ernesto had said, I need a little more time. And Clara had looked at him with the clarity of someone who has just received the answer they were looking for, even if it was not the one they wanted. "That's not more time," she said. "That's the answer." She was right. He knew she was right in the moment she said it, with a completeness of a recognition that left no room for negotiation. She was right, and she was generous enough not to make it ugly, and she was clear enough not to let it be ambiguous. And 3 weeks later, they had ended it with a kind of ending that is worse in some ways than the dramatic kind, because there's no adequate place to put the feeling, no wrongdoing to assign it to, no villain to organize the grief around. Just two people in a kitchen on a Sunday morning understanding that something real and good had not been enough, because the missing piece was not affection or compatibility or respect, but Ernesto's capacity to step fully into his own life and stay there. He wrote all of this in the notebook. He wrote it without editorializing, without the protective distance of self-deprecating irony that he usually deployed when he got too close to something painful. He wrote it straight, the way the first letter had demanded and the second had confirmed and the third had deepened, as if the only audience was himself and the only obligation was accuracy. Then he wrote about the second moment, the one at 34, more briefly, because some things require less words when they carry more weight. When the weight is the thing and words around it are only the container. She wanted it to, he wrote. That was the difference from Clara. Clara wanted to know if I wanted it. She didn't know yet. We were at the same place at the same time, and we could see it together. The same future, with the same clarity. We talked about it as if it were real, which it was, which is why what I did was worse, because I wasn't withholding from someone who was waiting for me to decide. I was withholding from someone who had already decided alongside me. And what premeditated, how I stepped back, how I made it smaller, how I found the way to unmake what we'd made together without ever saying outright that I was unmaking it. That's the thing I'm not ready to write about yet, but I will. That's what the notebook is for. He stopped. He put the pen down and pressed his palms flat against the desk, a gesture he hadn't planned and didn't understand until he recognized it as the physical equivalent of steadying, the body asking for something solid. Then he picked the pen back up, because the letter wasn't finished. The letter hadn't even reached its real subject yet. "Nicholas," he wrote, "you are 8 years old and your hair never stays where anyone puts it. You have a way of asking the second question when everyone else has stopped at the first, which I know is something I would find both wonderful and completely exhausting in the way that the best things are exhausting. Not because they drain you, but because they require you to be fully present. And being fully present is its own kind of work. I don't know your mother's name. I've decided not to decide that tonight, because the letter is to you, and the details of how you came into being, which version of the story produced you, Clara or someone else or someone I haven't met yet, are less important than the fact of you, the imaginative fact of you, which is the only kind of fact available. I want to tell you what I think you would have been like, not what I would have wanted you to be." That's a different letter. And a worse one, the kind fathers write in their heads without knowing it, the kind that turns children into projects. I want to tell you what I think you actually would have been like, based on the evidence available, which is primarily me, and the parts of me I have some hope about. You would have been patient in some things and impatient in others, and the distribution would have surprised people because it would not have followed the expected logic. Patient with ideas. You would have been able to sit with a question that didn't have an answer and not need to resolve it immediately, which is rarer than it sounds, and more valuable than most of the skills people spend years acquiring. Impatient with dishonesty, not in the moralistic sense, but in the practical sense. You would have found lying exhausting, not because you were virtuous, but because you were efficient, and lying requires too much maintenance. You would have liked rain. I don't know why I know that, but I do. He stopped writing and looked at what he'd written and felt something that he had been holding at a careful distance. For the entire evening began to close the distance of its own accord, without asking permission, the way certain feelings do when you finally give them the page to move toward. He kept writing. "The thing I want to tell you, the thing that is both the easiest and the hardest thing in this letter is that it wasn't about you. I need you to understand that, even though you don't exist, and therefore there's no you to understand anything. Which is a fact I'm going to set aside for the purposes of this letter, because the alternative is to not write it at all, and not writing it is no longer an option. It wasn't about you. It wasn't that I didn't want you. The wanting was never the problem. The wanting was there from the beginning, in a form that surprised me with its clarity and its consistency. Not a vague someday maybe one. Not the abstract preference for a life that includes children the way it includes a house or a career, but a specific and persistent wanting that had your particular shape, even before I had your name. The problem was the same problem that produced all the other letters. The same problem that kept me in the parking garage for 11 minutes, and the letter in the drawer for 2 years, and my mouth closed in the museum in March. The problem is that wanting something and accepting the full reality of that something, accepting what it will change, what it will demand, what it will make impossible to take back, are two entirely different operations, and I have always been better at the first than the second. To have you would have meant committing to a future I couldn't preview. To have you would have meant accepting that my life, which I had managed with a certain careful control, was going to be permanently and irreversibly reorganized around someone else's needs, someone else's growth, someone else's becoming. And that specifically was the thing I couldn't cross toward. Not because I didn't love you. You weren't there to love yet, but because I was afraid of loving you and being insufficient to it. Because I was afraid of bringing you into the gap between who I was and who I wanted to be, and having you live in that gap with me. Grow up in it. Be shaped. Be Italiano. I was afraid of transmitting the stillness, of passing it on. That's the thing I haven't said out loud until now. That's the thing that lives underneath the other explanations. The timing, the circumstances, the relationships that weren't ready. All of which are real, and all of which are also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was afraid of being your father, the way I have always been afraid of every real thing. Not because I didn't want it, but because I did, and wanting it made it possible to fail at it. And failing at it would have been the failure I could not survive. So I chose the absence. I chose it twice, in 2 different forms, with 2 different women, and I called the choice by other names when I needed to give it a name. And I got very good at not looking directly at what I was choosing. And I want you to know, even though you don't exist, even though this letter has no address, and no recipient, and no possibility of arriving anywhere, I want you to know that the absence has a shape. That I know the exact dimensions of it. That on Sunday mornings, in this apartment, with a particular light that Sunday mornings produce, I feel it with a specificity that non-existent things are not supposed to be capable of producing. You would have been 8 years old. Your hair would not have stayed where anyone put it. I'm sorry I was afraid of loving you well enough. I'm sorry I chose the safe version of myself over the real one, and that the real one was the one who would have been your father. Ernesto set the pen down. He sat in the chair that chirped with every movement and didn't move for a long time, so the chair was silent. The apartment was very quiet. The rain had not returned tonight. The city maintained its distant murmur, that residual sound of existing at scale. But up here in the 4th floor apartment, it was quiet enough that Ernesto could hear his own breathing, which he rarely noticed, which most people rarely notice, but which becomes audible in certain kinds of silence. The kinds that arrive after something has been said that cannot be taken back. The conversation with the other Ernesto, when it came, was different from the previous 3. It was different because the other Ernesto didn't sit in the dining chair. He stood near the window, with his back partly to the room, looking out at the city in the way Ernesto himself often stood at that window. Not looking at anything specific, but looking towards something. Making use of the distance. When Eternity's expression was the most unguarded it had been across all the conversations. Which was to say it had given up the slight protective distance that the previous versions had maintained. The composure of someone who has processed their choices and reached a working relationship with them. This one hadn't entirely processed it. It's not what you think, the other Ernesto said. Not defensive, just preempting a conclusion. What do I think? You think I have him? That, in my version, there's a Nicholas who is 8 years old and whose hair doesn't stay where you put it. He paused. It's more complicated than that. Ernesto looked at him. Tell me. The other Ernesto moved from the window and sat. Finally, not in the dining chair, but on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, in the posture of someone having a conversation they've been preparing for and which is harder than the preparation suggested. I made the commitment, he said, with Clara. I said yes. Not I think I do. Not primera y en 82. Why, yes. Clearly. Before the 2 months were up, I said it with 11 days to spare, which isn't a long way from the wire, but is still before it, which apparently made the difference. And with Threath. For 2 years we tried, and it was the kind of trying that teaches you everything about yourself you didn't know. And some of what you learn is good, and some of it is very difficult, and all of it is real in a way that nothing else I have ever done has been real. He stopped. It didn't happen. For reasons that had nothing to do with the decision and everything to do with biology, which is its own kind of lesson about the limits of courage as a tool. Courage gets you to the decision. It doesn't control what the decision produces. Ernesto absorbed this, so you don't have him either. Not in that version. The other Ernesto looked at him steadily. But I know something you don't. I know what it is to have tried. I know what it is to have wanted something fully, and pursued it fully, and had the pursuing be real, regardless of the outcome. And I know, he paused, and when he continued, his voice had the quality of something that cost him to say, I know that the grief of trying and not succeeding is a completely different animal from the grief of not trying. It's not smaller. In some moments, it's considerably larger, but it has a different shape. It passages. It ends. Mine doesn't end, Ernesto said. No, the other Ernesto said. Yours doesn't end, because yours has a question inside it. Always the question. What if I had said yes? What if I had moved before the conversation started? What if there had been a Nicholas and he had been exactly what you imagine and everything had been? And that what if is the thing that doesn't close. It stays open. Indefinitely. Ernesto wrote all of this. He wrote it with the pen that was running low on ink. Now, he could feel the slight inconsistency in the line, and he wrote it anyway, because stopping to find another pen felt like exactly the kind of interruption that this particular night could not sustain his Stat Wars. He asked, in the notebook, of the other Ernesto who was not in the room, but who was, in some way that Ernesto had stopped trying to categorize, present. The answer came not in the other Ernesto's voice, but in his own, which by now were sometimes indistinguishable. Yes, the open question is worse, but it's also the only one you can still do something about. He wrote Nicholas one more thing before he closed the letter, a short thing, because the long thing had been said and what remained was smaller and more specific, and somehow more important for being smaller. You would have asked me questions I didn't know the answers to. Not to embarrass me, just because you wanted to know, and you hadn't yet learned the habit of pretending that not knowing is embarrassing. You would have asked, and I would have had to say I don't know, and that would have been, I think, the most useful thing anyone could have said to me on a regular basis for the last 15 years. I don't know, Nicholas. I don't know if I would have been good at it. I don't know if the fear would have resolved or simply changed form. I don't know if the stillness in me is transmissible or if it's the kind of thing that stops when the life it's organizing changes enough. I don't know, but I'm beginning to understand that I don't know is a beginning, not ending. That not knowing isn't a reason to stay still. That you go toward the thing you want while not knowing, and the not knowing is part of the going, not a precondition for it. You would have known that already. At 8 years old, you would have been very patient with me while I figured it out. He closed the notebook. He sat in the quiet apartment, in the chair that chirped when he moved and was silent when he didn't. And for a while he simply existed in the specific stillness of having said everything there was to say about a particular thing, which is a different kind of stillness from the kind he had been living in. Not the stillness of avoidance, but the stillness of completion, the stillness of a room after everything has been moved and before anything new has been brought in. The manila envelope was still on the desk, visible from where he sat. The notebook was closed beneath it. He thought about Nicholas, whose hair didn't stay where you put it. He thought about the Sunday mornings, the apartment that was one person short, and he thought about what the other Ernesto had said. The only one you can still do something about. He didn't know exactly what that meant in practical terms. He wasn't sure he was ready to know. but he held it the way you hold the first sentence of something you haven't written yet. Tentatively, with attention, with the understanding that it's the beginning of a thing and not the thing itself, and that the thing itself requires time and honesty, and the willingness to stay in the room when the conversation gets difficult. A was 37 years old. Nicholas at 8 would have said. So what are you going to do about it? And Ernesto, for the first time in a very long time, didn't immediately have a reason why he couldn't answer. Chapter 5. The Letter to the One Who Learned to Leave. There is a question that lives underneath all the other questions, and Ernesto had known it was there from the first night. From the first sentence written in the blue notebook. From the moment the pen moved before the mind could stop it. He had known the way things at the bottom of a body of water you can't see it clearly from the surface. The light distorts it. The depth makes it look different from what it is. But it's there. You can feel the way it affects everything above it. The way the water moves differently over something substantial, resting at the bottom. The first 4 letters had been, in ways he was only now beginning to understand, a preparation for this one. Paris had been about the life unlived in the external world, the geography he hadn't entered, the version of himself shaped by different latitudes and different libraries, and the particular education of existing somewhere that didn't know his name. Elena had been about the words unspoken, the sentence withheld at the edge of the voice, the cost of the silence, maintained for long enough that it becomes its own kind of statement. Meridian had been about the hours, 12 years, of competent, careful, thoroughly wasted hours spent being good at something that was never his, organized in service of a structure he hadn't built and didn't believe in and couldn't bring himself to leave. And Nicholas had been the deepest excavation of all, the one that went past the decisions and into the constitutional question underneath them. What exactly was Ernesto Vidal afraid of, at the most fundamental level, when he looked at a real life and stepped back from it? The 5th letter was different. He had sensed this even before he opened the notebook, even before he sat down in the chair that chirped. The 5th letter was different because it was the only one not addressed to a version of himself that had done something he hadn't. It was addressed to a version of himself that had stopped doing something he was still doing. He wrote it at the top of the page, slowly, with more deliberateness than any of the previous opening lines. To you, who finally understood that leaving is not the same as running. Then he set the pen down and looked at that sentence for a long time. Because that was the thing. That was the question underneath all the other questions. The one resting at the bottom of the water affecting everything above it. Ernesto Vidal had spent his entire adult life confusing 2 things that were not the same. He had confused leaving with abandoning. He had confused departure with betrayal. He had confused the act of moving towards something with the act of moving away from something else, as if all movement were inherently a form of loss rather than a form of arrival, as if choosing one direction necessarily meant destroying what was in the other direction rather than simply not being there. He had stayed in Paris because leaving his mother would have been abandonment. He had stayed silent with Elena because leaving the safety of the friendship would have been destruction. He had stayed at Meridian because leaving the stability would have been irresponsibility. He had not become a father because leaving his solitude that carefully maintained, meticulously organized, deeply familiar solitude would have been the most permanent and irreversible departure of all. And so he had stayed. Everywhere and everything. Not because staying was what he wanted, but because staying was what he could justify, what he could explain, what he could look at in the mirror without having to account for the full cost of the choice. Staying looked like loyalty, like responsibility, like patines, like groundedness, like all the virtues that the careful man assembles around himself like furniture around a room's emptiness. Not to fill the emptiness, but to make it less visible, to give visitors somewhere to look that isn't the center of the space. The center of the space, in Ernesto Vidal's life, was this. He did not know how to leave gracefully, and because he didn't know how to leave, he had never fully arrived anywhere. He had learned the confusion from his father. That needs to be said, not as an excuse. Ernesto was 37 years old, and had been beyond the age of blaming parents for his choices for a considerable time. And Ek knew it, and the notebook knew it. But as a piece of archaeology, as one of those foundational facts that don't determine outcomes, but do determine the initial conditions from which outcomes grow. His father's name was Roberto Vidal. He was 64 years old now. living in a smaller city 3 hours north with a woman named Patricia whom Ernesto had met twice and found perfectly pleasant in the manner of people encountered in contexts that carry too much complicated history to assess. Clearly, Roberto Vidal was a man who had left dramatically, without adequate preparation, in the way that people leave when they've stayed too long past the point of no return and finally depart with all the urgency of something that should have moved years earlier and didn't. He had left Ernesto's mother after 18 years of a marriage that had stopped being a marriage in any meaningful sense somewhere around year 11, and had continued for 7 additional years as a shared administrative arrangement for raising a child and maintaining appearances and avoiding the particular difficulty of ending something. When Roberto finally left, on that Sunday morning with the small suitcase and the absence of scene, he had left completely. Not gradually, not with the careful consideration of a man managing a transition, but with the totality of someone who had been storing departure energy for 7 years, and released it all at once. He had left the marriage, the apartment, the neighborhood, and effectively the city, transferring to a position in the northern office of his company with a speed that suggested the opportunity had been engineered rather than discovered. He had left his wife, his son, his routines, his half of the furniture, his claim on the particular Saturday afternoons of a particular life, with a particular completeness that left nothing in between. He had called every Sunday. He had sent money reliably, more than his legal obligation, which Ernesto's mother had accepted without thanks and without complaint, depositing it with the expression of someone receiving something owed rather than given. He had appeared at important occasions with the slightly overdressed care of a man who was aware of his deficit and was attempting to compensate through presentation. He had been, by the external measures available, a responsible absent father, which is a category that is real and also insufficient, and also not the same thing as a present one. What Roberto Vidal had taught his son, not through instruction, but through demonstration, not deliberately, but with the comprehensive thoroughness of lessons absorbed before the learner has the critical faculties to evaluate them, was this: leaving causes damage. Leaving tears things. Leaving is an act of violence against the people and the structures you depart from, and the damage it causes is proportional to the accumulated weight of what should have been done before the leaving became necessary. Ernesto had watched his mother in the months after his father left with the vigilant attention of a 12-year-old who has decided, without articulating the decision, that he is now responsible for monitoring the situation. He had watched the shape of her grief, which was not loud or demonstrative. She was not a loud or demonstrative woman, but which was present in everything. In the way she made coffee for one and forgot sometimes and made it for two. In the way she moved through the apartment with a reorganized efficiency that was slightly too deliberate. In the way certain Saturdays had a quality that was different from other days. Not sadder exactly, but emptied of whatever had previously given them their specific texture. He had watched all of this and learned, this is what departure costs. This is what happens to the people you leave. This is what it means to be the one who goes, rather than the one who stays. And he had decided, again without articulating the decision, because 12-year-olds don't articulate the decisions that shape them. They simply make them. In the wordless interior of a self still under construction, he had decided that he would not be the one who causes that. He would be the stayer. He would be the reliable one, the present one, the one who doesn't produce that particular emptiness in the people around him by the act of his departure. It was a generous decision in its origin. It was made from love, genuinely, with the real love of a child for the parent he is watching suffer. The problem was not the love. The problem was that the decision was made at 12 and never revisited, never examined, never updated with the information available to a man of 20 or 25 or 30 or 37. The decision calcified. It became invisible. It became simply the way things were, the background operating assumption of every subsequent choice. Staying is loyalty, leaving is damage. Therefore stay. Therefore always, and in everything, stay. He wrote all of this in the notebook. He wrote it more quickly than the previous letters, with the pace of something that has been understood for a while but not yet said. Something that moves fast once the channel opens because it's been pressurized behind a closed valve for a long time. Then he wrote the sentence that the letter had been building toward since the opening line. The sentence he had been avoiding with the same careful orbit he had brought to the third letter. The same cautious circling of something central and hot. The year I'm not talking about is the year I was 33, and the person I'm not talking about is the reason I'm writing all of this at all. He stopped. He looked at what he'd written. He had promised himself, on the fourth night, that this letter would contain the thing the fourth letter had briefly touched, and then stepped back from the second moment, the one at 34, referred to only as she, handled with the tenderness reserved for open wounds. He had promised himself the notebook because the notebook was the unedited version, and the unedited version required this. Her name was Sofia Letters. Sofia Guerrero, 31 years old when he met her, which made him 32. A translator, Spanish, French, Italian, with Portuguese as what she called her comfortable emergency option, which was the kind of phrase that told you immediately what kind of person was speaking it. She translated literary fiction primarily, the kind of work that requires not just the transfer of meaning between languages, but the recreation of voice, of register, of the specific music of a sentence in one language, rebuilt from scratch in another. She talked about it the way Marcos talked about wood and Clara talked about parks, as if the work were alive, as if it had opinions about itself, as if her job were less to impose her craft on it than to listen carefully enough that it told her what it needed. He had met her at a reading a novelist whose work they had both admired independently, at a small venue that held perhaps 40 people and smelled of old paper and the particular dust of a building that has housed books for decades. That specific smell that is to certain people what certain music is to others. Immediately and completely home. They had ended up standing near each other in the narrow space between the last row of chairs and the back wall, and she had said something quietly, not to him specifically, more to the room, to the air, about the passage the novelist had just read. And what she said was so precisely what Ernesto himself had been thinking that he had turned toward her with the automatic reflex of someone who hears their own internal monologue spoken out loud by a stranger and needs to confirm that it actually happened. It had actually happened. She looked at him when he turned, unsurprised by his turning, as if she'd known he would, and said, "Sorry, I tend to think out loud at readings." "Don't apologize," he said. "You said the thing I was thinking." "Then we were both right," she said, and smiled, and that was it. That was the whole of it, as simple as that. What followed was 14 months, the same length, by coincidence, or by some irony of his internal architecture. Us, with Clara, as if he were allotted a specific duration before the point of real commitment, and his system reset itself to the same interval regardless of the person. The 14 months with Sofia were different from the 14 months with Clara in every specific way while being identical in the one way that mattered. They moved with the same gentle and certain accumulation toward the same junction point, the same place where the relationship either becomes a different and more serious thing or reveals itself to have been a long and elaborate approach to a door that won't open. With Clara, the junction had been children. With Sofia, the junction was simpler and more devastating in its simplicity. It was the question of whether Ernesto was willing to be fully present. Not metaphorically. Not in the broad existential sense that the previous letters had been examining, but practically, concretely, in the daily and unremarkable and absolutely necessary sense of being available, of showing up, of allowing someone to rely on him in the way that real partnership requires, and that Ernesto had always managed to be slightly, carefully, structurally unavailable for. Sofia had said it directly, because she was a person who worked with language for a living and had a translator's intolerance for and the conversation they had about it was the most honest conversation Ernesto had participated in up to that point in his life, and one of the most honest up to the point of writing this letter. "You're here," she said, "and you're not here. And I've been trying to figure out which one is the real one, the one that's here or the one that isn't, and I think the answer is that they're both real and you haven't decided which one gets to be in charge," Ernesto had said. "I'm trying," Sofia had said. "I know. I can see that you're trying, but trying to be present is different from being present, and I think you know that. And I think the gap between those two things is something I can't close from my side." He had not responded to that with the honesty it deserved. He had responded with more trying, with the particular effortful variety of presence that is actually its own form of absence. Too deliberate to be real, too managed to be felt, too clearly an attempt to perform the thing rather than be the thing. And Sophia, who translated voice for a living and could hear the difference between a sentence that was written and a sentence that was felt, had heard the performance in it with the accuracy of a tuning fork and had known, with the resigned clarity of someone who has been given all the information they need and would have preferred different information, what it meant. They had ended at month 14, on a Sunday evening. Of course, a Sunday. The day that had always carried a different weight in Ernesto's life. The day of his father's departure. The day of the too quiet apartment. The day of the coffee made for one in her apartment rather than his. With a conversation that was the opposite of the ending, with Clara in every detail and identical to it in every essential. Quiet, honest, without assigned blame, and conclusive in the way that only conversations between people who are being fully honest with each other can be conclusive. No ambiguity to return to, no unsaid thing to use as a reason to reopen it. Just two people in a Sunday evening apartment, understanding with complete clarity that they had arrived at the end of the road they had been building together, and that the road had ended here, not because of a failure of love or of compatibility, but because of a failure of availability, and that Ernesto's failure of availability was so fundamental and so long-standing that it was not going to be corrected by the love of any specific woman, no matter how well-placed, no matter how generously offered. "I think you need to figure out what you're staying for," Sophie had said at the door when he was leaving. Not unkindly, in the manner of a translator who has found the most accurate word for a thing and offers it simply, without decoration. Not what you're afraid to leave, what you're actually staying for. Because those are different questions, and I think you've been answering the second one when the first one is the one that matters. He had carried that sentence home through the Sunday evening city. He had carried it for 4 years without adequately examining it. In the same way he carried the resignation letter in the drawer. Present, acknowledged, not yet acted upon. He was acting upon it now, at 37, in a chair that chirped, with a pen running low on ink, and a notebook that was more than half full, and a manila envelope on the desk that hadn't gone back in the drawer. "What you're staying for," he wrote in the notebook. Not what you're afraid to leave. He wrote it, and then wrote it again on the next line, slightly differently, because the repetition wasn't redundancy, but examination. The way you turn an object in different light to see if it reveals something new. "What are you staying for, Ernesto?" He sat with a question, not for the dramatic effect of sitting with a question. He had little patience for his own performance at this point in the proceedings, but because the question was genuinely and specifically difficult in a way that surprised him. He had expected, reaching this letter, to have some answer available. 4 letters of excavation, 4 evenings of the most sustained honesty he had brought to anything in recent memory, should have produced by now at least the outline of an answer. What he found instead was this. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know what he was staying for. He knew in precise and well-catalogued detail what he was afraid to leave: the stability, the predictability, the particular safety of a life organized around the avoidance of the irreversible. He could list it with the thoroughness of a man who had been maintaining the inventory for years. But the other side of the ledger, what he was staying for, what the staying was in service of, what good thing was being protected or cultivated or sustained by the immobility that ledger was, when he looked at it honestly, almost entirely empty. He had been staying for nothing, or rather, he had been staying for the absence of the consequences of leaving, which is not the same as staying for something. He had confused the avoidance of a negative with the pursuit of a positive, and the confusion had been so long-standing and so comprehensive that it had become the architecture of his entire adult life. He picked up the pen. "This is what I think happened to you," he wrote, addressing the other Ernesto, the one who had learned to leave, the one who had understood the difference. "I think at some point, and I want to know when, I want the specific moment, because specificity is the only honest currency in these letters. You understood that staying is only a virtue when there's something worth staying for. That loyalty is only loyalty when it's chosen freely, when the person capable of leaving makes the informed decision not to. That presence is only presence when the person present has had the genuine option of absence and has evaluated both and chosen to be there. Otherwise, it's not staying. It's not loyalty. It's not presence. It's just the absence of departure, which is an entirely different thing and which feels From the inside, like safety and looks. From the outside, like rootedness. But is in fact neither of those things. It is simply the state of a person who is not yet left, which has no virtue in itself, which proves nothing, which costs nothing, which gives nothing. I have been the person who has not yet left for 15 years, in every meaningful context of my life, and I've told myself very convincingly, with very good arguments, with the internal logic of someone who has had a lot of practice, that this was a choice, that this was who I was, that some people are stayers and some people are leavers, and I was a stayer and that was fine. That was good, that was even admirable in certain lights. But Sophia was right. I wasn't staying for something. I was staying because leaving required me to be the kind of person who decides, and deciding requires accepting that the decision is yours. And if the decision is yours, then the consequences are yours. And if the consequences are yours, then you can't distribute them. You can't share the weight of them with circumstance, or with the needs of other people, or with the logic of the responsible choice. They are simply yours, and I've spent 15 years finding ways to ensure that as few things as possible were simply mine. He stopped writing. He looked at the page. He had just described something he had never described before. Not to a therapist. Not to Marcos. Not to any of the women who had known him well enough to deserve it. He had described it to the notebook, which was perhaps the only audience he'd been capable of. The only audience that couldn't walk away or be disappointed or reorganize its understanding of him based on the information. The notebook just received it. That was what notebooks did. They received. The other, Ernesto, came in differently tonight. He didn't appear in the dining chair, didn't stand at the window, didn't arrange himself in any of the locations he'd occupied across the previous evenings. He was simply there, in the room, in the way that presences are sometimes simply there without having arrived ambient, occupying the space without taking up a specific point in it, distributed rather than located. Ernesto felt him rather than saw him, which was new, and which seemed appropriate for the fifth letter, the penultimate excavation, the one that was getting closest to something so central it didn't have a specific shape yet. "Tell me when it was," Ernesto said, or wrote. The distinction had collapsed entirely by this point in the evenings. The writing and the speaking and the thinking had merged into a single operation. The specific moment, the answer took longer than usual to form. When it came with a different quality than the previous answers. Less confident, less processed, more like something being remembered in real time than something that had already been digested into understanding. It wasn't a moment, the other Ernesto said. That's the first thing. I know you want a moment, because moments are what the letters have been built around the plane, the museum, the outbox, the question about children. And those are all real. They all happened. They were all decisive. But this one didn't work that way. This one was a process, a long, unglamorous, poorly lit process that took about a year and produced no goadable instant. "Tell me the process then." "After Sophia," the other Ernesto said. "After Sophia, I spent a long time alone. Not dramatically alone. Not in the way people describe isolation in memoirs, with its implied grandeur. The solitary figure against the wide landscape, just ordinarily alone, in an ordinary apartment, with ordinary days. I went to work and came home and had dinner and read and went to bed. I called Marcos on Thursdays. I talked to my mother on Sundays. I did all the things you do. I just did them without the layer of narrative I'd always maintained around them, the story about why the circumstances were what they were and why they would change later and why the current configuration was temporary and leading towards something. I let the story drop, just for a while, just to see what was under it. And what was under it? Another pause. Nothing I hadn't suspected. But seeing it without the story around it is different from suspecting it. Suspicion has a future tense built into it. You suspect something might be true, which implies it might not be. Seeing it without the story is just present tense. Just, this is what's here. This is the actual size and shape of the life you're living. Here it is, in the clear, without narration. Was that enough? Just seeing it? No. Seeing it was the beginning. The next part was deciding whether it was enough, and the answer I found very slowly, over many ordinary evenings, in an ordinary apartment, was no, not in anger, not in crisis, not with the dramatic clarity of a revelation. Just no. Not enough. And the no not being enough wasn't a judgment of the life, or of the choices, or of the person who had made them. It was just an honest answer to an honest question. Is this an og? No. What do I want that I don't have, that required more time? What did you want? Primarily, the other Ernesto said, and the word landed with the weight of something specific. I wanted to be in motion. Not the motion of going somewhere particular, though that was part of it, but motion as a state of being, rather than an occasional event. I'd lived in stillness so long that stillness had come to feel like my natural state, my baseline, the water I swam in without feeling wet. I wanted to know what it felt like to be a person who moved through the world, making choices rather than a person who moved through the world, making sure to minimize the disturbance their passage created. And how do you get that? You practice small departures, the other Ernesto said. That's what I learned. You don't practice leaving by making the grand gesture, by quitting everything at once, by reorganizing your life in a single dramatic movement. You practice by leaving small things. You practice by finishing the dinner that isn't working and paying the check and not ordering dessert out of social obligation. You practice by saying no to the plan that doesn't serve you, to the obligation that isn't actually obligatory, to the conversation that you're maintaining out of inertia rather than genuine connection. You practice by leaving rooms, by ending things that have ended, by not staying past the point where staying still means something. Small departures. Small departures. The other confirmed. Until leaving stops feeling like damage and starts feeling like accuracy. Until you can distinguish between leaving something that needs you and leaving something that you've confused with needing you, because it's familiar and because leaving it would require you to be the one who decided. Until the departure itself, the actual act of going, stops being the thing you're managing around and starts being the ordinary instrument of a life that moves in the direction it actually wants to move in. Ernesto wrote all of this. He wrote it with the pen that was definitely running low now, the line visibly thinner in places, requiring more pressure. But he did not stop to find another pen because stopping felt like exactly the kind of small false staying that the letter was in the process of identifying. And Sophia, he wrote, in your version, after the process, did you go back? The room was very quiet. No, the other Ernesto said. That's not what the process was for. The process wasn't toward her. She was right that she couldn't close the gap from her side. And I was wrong to have let the gap exist as long as it did. And going back would have been another form of using her presence as the corrective to an absence that was mine too, correct? She deserved someone who arrived already capable of being there, not someone who was using her as the occasion to practice. So the process was just for you. The process was for me, the other Ernesto said, and for the first time, across all 5 evenings, across all the variations and all the conversations and all the different registers in which the other Ernesto had appeared. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. Something earned rather than inherited. That's the thing I had to learn that took the longest. That the work of becoming capable of a real life is yours. It's not the work of the relationship that's going to receive the result. You do it alone, or you do it in the company of people who are generous enough to witness it. But you do it for yourself first and foremost, because that's the only way it actually gets done. Doing it for someone else, doing it as a gift to the relationship, as a rescue of something you've already damaged, doesn't work. Or it works temporarily, which is worse, because it convinces you that you've solved something you've only delayed. You do it for yourself. You do it, the other Ernesto said, because the life in question is yours. Because the hours are yours. Because the mornings are yours. And the Sunday quiet is yours. And the coffee's yours. And the particular shape of the days is yours. And if the shape doesn't fit what you actually are, then no amount of good explanation or responsible justification or loyalty to the staying changes that fundamental mismatch. You do it because at some point the cost of not doing it becomes higher than the cost of doing it. and you can feel the crossover happening even if you can't precisely locate it in time. You do it because otherwise you spend your whole life in the terminal watching planes depart. The last sentence landed in the room with the quality of something that closes a circle. Ernesto had started the first letter, the first night, the first line, with the terminal, the plane taking off, the staying instead of the going. And here it was again, the image returning not as a beginning but as a recognition. A before and after that sat in the same metaphor and contained entirely different relationships to the choice embedded in it. He wrote it down. He wrote the whole last exchange down. And then he wrote, at the bottom of the page, in the slightly failing ink of the pen that had carried him through 5 evenings of the most honest work he had done in 15 years. I am in the terminal. I have been in the terminal for 15 years. I know every gate. I know the smell of the departure lounge and the particular sound of the flight board updating and the way the light comes through the high windows in the late afternoon when most of the day's flights have already gone. I know the terminal the way you know a place you've lived in too long. Not with love, but with the intimate, slightly resentful familiarity of the habitual. You left the terminal, not because you were certain where you were going, not because the flight was guaranteed to land somewhere good, not because you had eliminated the possibility of the crash. You left because the terminal is not a destination, because knowing the terminal well is not the same as being somewhere, because the competence you build in the waiting is not transferable to the living. And the living was always the point. I've been very competent in the waiting. I want to learn what I'm competent at in the living. He closed the letter there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything more that could be said was located in the future, in the part of the story that hadn't been written yet. And the notebook was the record of the excavation, not the blueprint of the construction. The excavation was almost complete. There was one more thing. The epilogue, the afterword. The question that the 5 letters had been circling and had not yet directly answered. But that was for another night. Tomorrow night. The last night. He closed the notebook. He looked at the desk, the manila envelope, the closed notebook, the pen, spent now, the ink, entirely gone, which he only confirmed by pressing it to the corner of the desk and finding that it left nothing. He went to the kitchen drawer, where he kept a small collection of pens and pencils, in the haphazard organization of someone who does not particularly care about the organization of pens and pencils. He took a new pen, blue, the same disposable type as the one that had run out, because some things you don't need to change, and brought it back to the desk and set it beside the notebook for tomorrow. Then he did something he hadn't done in any of the previous 4 evenings. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment. The screen reflected his face, back at him, the familiar face, the slightly crooked nose, the eyes that were his father's and that he had spent years being ambivalent about for exactly that reason. He looked at his face in the dark screen for a moment, and then opened the contacts. Marcos was at the top of the recent calls. He looked at the name. It was 11:40 at night. Too late to call. He put the phone face down on the desk. Then he picked it up again and typed a message. Not long. Just lunch tomorrow. Thai place. I have something I want to tell you. He sent it before the conversation with himself could start. The one about whether it was too late to text and whether Marcos would wonder what it was about and whether saying I have something to tell you was too dramatic and whether he should just wait until Thursday when they usually talked anyway. He sent it before all of that, because the other Ernesto had said, "Move before the argument starts." The message delivered. The small double chick appeared beside it. Gray Anton. After a moment, Blue Marcos was awake. Or the phone was read-receipted. Or the universe was occasionally cooperative with small gestures. 3 dots appeared. The typing indicator. Then, about time. Yes. Noon. Ernesto set the phone down. He looked at the desk, the notebook, the envelope, the new pen, the phone with its small blue confirmation. He looked at all of it together and felt, not dramatically, not with the music-swelling quality of cinematic revelation, but with the quiet and specific and completely undeniable sensation of someone who has been in the same position for a very long time and has just shifted their weight in a different direction. Something had moved. Not Everything. Not the life, not the job, not the accumulated stillness of 15 years. Just something. Just the weight, redistributed by a fraction. Just the angle, adjusted by degrees, too small to be visible from any distance, but perceptible from inside. The way a ship's course correction of a single degree is invisible from the deck and determines, over a long enough distance, an entirely different landfall. He was still in the terminal. He knew that. He didn't pretend otherwise, because the notebook had established from the first night that pretending was not what it was for. He was still in the terminal. Still 37. Still in the apartment, with 4 chairs and 1 person, and the desk with the letter in the envelope, and the blue notebook with the almost finished excavation. But Marcos knew now that something was coming, and knowing that Marcos knew felt, in a way Ernesto couldn't fully explain and didn't particularly need to, like a different kind of reality than knowing it alone, like the difference between a decision made in secret and a decision witnessed, like the difference between a thought and a sentence, like the difference, to go back to the beginning, between a quaderno found and a quaderno written in. He looked at the desk one more time before going to bed. He thought about what the other Ernesto had said about small departures, about practicing leaving, about the accumulation of small, accurate acts, until the departure stops feeling like damage and starts feeling like direction. He thought about Sophia saying, "Figure out what you're staying for, not what you're afraid to leave." He thought about Nicholas, whose hair didn't stay where you put it, and who would have asked the second question when everyone else stopped at the first, and who would have been 8 years old now on Sunday mornings, in the particular light of Sunday mornings. And the thought had the shape. It always had that Sunday morning shape, that apartment one-person short shape. But it also had, tonight, something different in it. Not resolution, not the comfortable closing of an unresolvable thing, but direction. The sense that the grief had a place to go, not a place that made it smaller, but a place that made it useful. The way certain kinds of pain are useful when they're honest about what they're pointing at, rather than just pointing at themselves. He turned off the light. The city continued outside, doing what cities do, existing at scale, indifferent, full of people in various stages of departure and arrival, full of letters written and unwritten, full of terminals and gates and flights that had already left, and flights still boarding and flights not yet scheduled, full of notebooks in bottom drawers waiting for the right evening, full, somewhere, of a dining table Marcos had made from wood, with a particular grain that he could point at and say, "That's the thing I made." Ernesto lay in the dark and thought about grain, about things you make with your hands that exist in the world after you're done with them, about what the grain of his own life might look like if he were ever to stop managing it and start making it instead. He didn't know yet. He genuinely didn't know, which by now he understood to be a beginning and not an ending. Tomorrow, lunch with Marcos, Thai place, noon. The night before the last letter, he slept. And for the first time in the 5 nights of the excavation, he slept without the particular quality of suspension that had characterized the previous nights. That sense of hanging between what had been said and what still needed saying, that incompleteness, held lightly in the body during sleep. Tonight, the sleep was different. Tonight, it had the quality of something that has exhaled, not arrived, not finished, not resolved, but exhaled. And in a life that had been holding its breath for 15 years, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Epilogue. The one who stayed at the window, the last entry in the blue notebook, began not with a letter. It began with a date. Ernesto had not dated any of the previous entries. That had been deliberate, in the unconscious way that certain choices are deliberate without ever being consciously made, because dating them would have given them a position in the official record of his life, would have made them documentable, verifiable, subject to the scrutiny of a future self who might use the dates as evidence of something or against something. The undated entries existed in a kind of temporal suspension, floating free of the calendar, free of the sequential logic of a life organized around days and appointments, and the incremental march of one Wednesday into the next. They existed in the time of the interior, which runs at a different speed and by different rules than the time of the exterior, and which has the particular quality of feeling both very old and very recent simultaneously, the way certain dreams feel when you wake from them. But tonight, he dated it. He wrote the date in the top right corner of the page. The full date, day and month and year, with the deliberateness of someone making a record that is meant to be found, that is meant to be evidence of a specific moment in the accountable, sequential, external time of a real life. Then he wrote, below it, "This is the last letter, but it is not addressed to another version of me. It is addressed to this one." He had come home from lunch with Marcos 6 hours earlier, and the lunch had been the kind that changes the specific gravity of the day it occurs in, the kind you carry differently than ordinary lunches, that weights the afternoon with a quality of significance that doesn't announce itself loudly but that you feel in the body as a slightly altered center of balance, as if something had been redistributed internally and the adjustment was still being processed by systems that work below the level of conscious awareness. The Thai place had been full at noon, the particular fullness of a lunch hour crowd in a small restaurant that everyone in the vicinity had decided was good, the best kind of full, the kind that produces noise and warmth and the sense of being in a place that is functioning exactly as it should. They had gotten the corner table, which was their usual table when it was available, the one against the wall that gave them both the view of the room and the privacy of a corner. The table they'd been sitting at for years across an accumulation of Tuesdays that contained more of both of their lives than either had ever catalogued. Marcos had ordered for both of them before Ernesto arrived. He always arrived first. He was constitutionally incapable of being late to anything. The precision was one of his defining characteristics, and Ernesto had long since stopped apologizing for being the later of the two, and was working through what appeared to be a significant amount of tea when Ernesto sat down. He looked at Ernesto the moment he sat, with that particular quality of attention he had always had, the kind that assessed and registered simultaneously, the kind that saw people as they actually were, rather than as they were presenting. He looked at him and said nothing for a moment, just looked, and then said, "You look different." "I haven't slept much," Ernesto said. "Not tired different," Marco said. Different. What happened? Ernesto had thought, on the walk over, about how to begin. He had composed several versions of the opening in his head, ranging from the oblique to the direct, and had found that all of them felt inadequate when held against the actual content, the actual 5 evenings, the actual weight of what had been excavated and set out in the open in the blue notebook on the desk. How do you compress 5 nights of the most honest internal work you have ever done into a lunch conversation? Even a long one. Even one at a corner table in a familiar restaurant with the one person you trust to receive it without rearranging it into something more manageable. You don't compress it, he had decided on the walk over. You just start. "I found a notebook," Ernesto said. He told him everything, not the letters themselves. Those were the notebooks. They had a privacy that wasn't secrecy but was something more like sanctity. The privacy of things said in their exact form that lose something essential when paraphrased. But everything else? The drawer, the first line, the 5 evenings, the conversations with the other Ernesto, Paris and Elena, and the resignation letter and Nicholas and Sophia and the question about staying and what you're staying for versus what you're afraid to leave. He told it chronologically, which was unusual for him. He was more typically a lateral thinker, a connector of non-adjacent things, but the story had a chronology, and the chronology mattered, and he let it carry the telling. Marcos listened in the way Marcos listened, completely, without the restless micro-expressions of someone composing their response while you're still speaking, without the empathetic interjections that are actually redirections, without the advice preloaded and ready to deploy at the first available pause, just listening, with the specific quality of attention that had always made him the person that Ernesto could tell things to, the quality that made the telling feel like it was actually going somewhere rather than simply being discharged into the air. When Ernesto finished, Marcos was quiet for a moment. The restaurant continued around them, the noise of other lunches, other conversations, the clatter of the kitchen, the particular acoustic texture of a full room that makes private conversation possible in a paradox of public intimacy. "How long?" Marcos said. 5 nights. 5 nights of that. 5 nights. Marcos nodded slowly, the nod of someone processing a quantity rather than a quality. Then he said, with the characteristic directness that Ernesto had come to rely on the way you rely on a compass. Not because it always pointed somewhere comfortable, but because it always pointed somewhere true. "What are you going to do?" And Ernesto had said surprising himself with the absence of qualification, with the lack of the usual hedge. The usual I think, or I'm considering, or I'm not sure yet, but he had said, send the letter, and then figure out the next thing. But send the letter first. Marcos had looked at him. The quiet look, the assessing one. Before the conversation starts, he had told Marcos at part 2 what the other Ernesto had said about moving before the argument organized itself. About the trick being the timing, the gap between knowing and the internal negotiation that dismantled the knowing. He had told it, and Marcos had recognized it with the recognition of someone who had lived it himself, who had stood in his own version of the parking garage, who had had his own version of the envelope in the drawer, who had moved before his own argument could start and had spent 4 years living with the results. Before the conversation starts, Ernesto confirmed. Marcos picked up his tea. He held it for a moment without drinking it, looking at Ernesto with an expression that was new, not the usual affectionate exasperation, not the patient watchfulness of a friend waiting for someone they believe in to catch up with the belief. Something more simple than that, something that was just warmth, just recognition, just the look of one person who knows another person well enough to see when something has genuinely shifted in them. Good, Marcos said. That was all? Just good. And then he put down the tea and picked up his fork and said, hit your food. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days. And the conversation moved on, and they talked about other things. And under all of it, under the ordinary texture of a long, familiar lunch between two people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable in the transitions between serious and ordinary, Ernesto felt the thing he had felt the previous night when the message sent and Marcos had responded. The specific altered weight of something that had been interior and was now, at least partially, exterior. Something witnessed, something real in a different register than the private. He had walked home from the Thai place through the afternoon city, and the city had been doing what it always did, which was everything simultaneously and indifferently, and Ernesto had walked through it with a quality of attention that was different from his usual ambulatory self-management. He had looked at things, not with the performed mindfulness of someone who has read about being present and is attempting to implement it as a discipline, but with the genuine, unrehearsed attention of someone whose interior is temporarily quiet enough that the exterior can come through. A woman walking a dog that was significantly larger than seemed practical for city living. Two men arguing with amiable intensity over something on one of their phones. A child, 8 years old, approximately, dark hair that had not been successfully managed, sitting on the steps of an apartment building eating something orange and watching the street with the uncomplicated attention of someone who has not yet learned to be somewhere else while being somewhere. Ernesto had looked at the child for a moment too long enough to catch the child's eye, who looked back at him without embarrassment or the performed indifference of older people, just looked back. Just registered his presence with the flat accuracy of someone who sees what's in front of them. Ernesto had nodded. The child had nodded back, small and grave, and somehow complete in the gesture, and then looked away at the street again. He had continued walking, and somewhere between the Thai place and his building, somewhere in the middle of an unremarkable block in an unremarkable part of the city on an ordinary afternoon in February, he had understood, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, but with the quiet authority of something that has been true for a while and has finally found the moment to be acknowledged, what the 5 letters had been building toward. What the real question was, the one underneath all the other questions, the one at the bottom of the water. It wasn't, what are you afraid of? It wasn't even, what are you staying for? The real question, the one that the 5 evenings of excavation had been assembling the conditions to ask, was simpler and more difficult than either of those. Who are you when you remove everything you chose by not choosing? He had stood still on the sidewalk for a moment when the question arrived, not in the performative manner of a man having a revelation on a street corner in a film, but in the literal, physical manner of a person who has just received a piece of information their legs need a moment to integrate before continuing to function. Then he had continued walking. He had walked home. He had gone up to the 4th floor. He had sat down at the desk with the notebook and the envelope and the new pen, and he had looked at all of it for a long time. Then he had picked up the manila envelope. He had opened it. He had read the letter inside, for the first time since writing it 2 years ago, all the way through without stopping. He had read it with the attention he would bring to something written by someone else, trying to hear it fresh, trying to hear it as the person who would receive it rather than the person who had written it. It was, he confirmed, still true. Every word of it still true, still honest, still specific, still the best professional writing he had ever done. He had folded it back into thirds. He had put it in the envelope. He had sealed the envelope. He had addressed it with the pen to his manager's name and the company address, and he had put it in the outside pocket of his bag, where it would stay until tomorrow morning, when he would walk into the office and put it in the outbox, before the conversation with himself had time to organize, before the argument. Then he had opened the notebook to the last page and written the date. "I don't know who I am," he wrote now. "When I remove everything I chose by not choosing, that is both the most honest thing I have written in this notebook and the most frightening. It is frightening because 37 is not 22. And the question that feels appropriate. At 22, who am I? Who am I becoming? Who is the person I'm in the process of constructing? Is a different texture at 37, carries a different weight, arrives with a different set of implications. At 22, the question is a beginning. At 37, it has the quality of an inventory taken late, of looking at a building that has been standing for a while and finding certain structural elements missing that should have been load-bearing, and having to decide what to do about the building, whether to reinforce, to rebuild, to continue operating in full knowledge of the structural situation, and simply being more careful about where you put your weight. But I am going to write it anyway. I am going to sit with it in this notebook, on this page, which is the last page, and say, I don't know. I genuinely don't know who I am without the choices I made by not choosing. I know who I am inside them. I know the Ernesto who stayed in the terminal, who stayed silent in the museum, who stayed in the gap between wanting Nicholas and committing to him, who stayed in the particular carefully maintained solitude that Sophia identified with more precision than I was ready for. I know that Ernesto. I have lived as that Ernesto for 15 years, and I know every room of him, every habit, every familiar reach and familiar retreat. What I don't know is what's left when you take that away. What's underneath what I was before I became the person organized around not leaving. What I wanted before I learned to want the continuation of the current arrangement as a substitute for wanting the thing itself. I am going to have to find out. That sentence is the most frightening one I've written in 5 nights of frightening sentences. Not because the finding out is impossible, but because it is actual, because it requires the thing I have been practicing the avoidance of for 15 years. Moving through the world, making choices rather than managing the consequences of not making them. Arriving at things instead of maintaining a careful orbit around them. Failing, probably, at some of them. And having those failures be loud and visible and mine in the specific way that only chosen failures can be mine. With no residual uncertainty about whether the life unlived might have been better, because the life unlived is going to start getting lived, starting tomorrow morning with the outbox. He set the pen down for a moment. The apartment was quiet. It was past midnight. He had been writing for hours, longer than any of the previous evenings, the longest sitting in 5 nights of long sittings. Outside the window, the city was doing its late-night version of itself, which was quieter but not silent. Always not silent. That residual human noise that Ernesto had come to understand as the sound of other people's lives continuing in their particular directions, with their particular choices and their particular failures and their particular notebooks and their particular drawers and their particular envelopes waiting. In their particular outbox, he picked the pen up again. I want to write about what I think is going to happen, not what I hope or what I plan or what I intend. What I think, with the honest probability assessment of a man who knows himself well enough to account for his own tendencies, while also knowing that the act of writing this down in a notebook that has demanded honesty from the first page constitutes a kind of commitment that mere hoping and planning don't. I think I am going to send the letter tomorrow, and that the sending is going to produce a fear that is different in quality from the fear I have been managing for 15 years. Managed fear. The fear of the staying. The ambient anxiety of a life organized around avoidance has a chronic low-grade quality. Like a sound you've been hearing so long you've stopped registering it as a sound. The fear after the sending is going to be acute. It is going to have an edge. It is going to be the fear of someone who has done the thing rather than the fear of someone who is watching the thing remain undone. And those are different fears. And the second kind is, I believe, the more bearable one, even when it's louder. Because it has a direction. Because it's the fear of what happens next rather than the fear of what might not happen ever. I think I am going to talk to Marcos more honestly than I have before, which started at the Thai place today, and which I intend to continue. Because I have been lucky enough to have a friend who makes honesty feel possible, and I have been the kind of person who uses that luck sparingly, which is a form of waste. I'm going to practice stopping. I think I am going to look for work that is mine. I don't know what that is yet. I have some ideas that I have been keeping in the category of impractical daydreams, and which I am going to begin treating as actual proposals, actual possibilities. Things that can be examined and assessed and attempted rather than maintained in the protected space of the purely hypothetical. The hypothetical doesn't accumulate experience, only the actual does. I think I am going to call my mother, not for any particular reason, not in response to any particular crises or obligation, but because she is 62 years old and because I have been in the habit of calling her with a frequency calibrated to the minimum required to be considered a present son rather than a frequency calibrated to what I would actually choose, if I chose it from genuine wanting rather than from the management of guilt. I am going to call her and talk to her the way I talk in this notebook. Not entirely, not with the specific content of the specific letters, but with the quality of it. I think I'm going to find it difficult. I think there are going to be mornings in the parking garage and envelopes that almost go back in the drawer, and conversations that I manage when I should be having, and paintings I look back at when I should be turning toward the person. I think the architecture of 15 years doesn't dismantle in 5 nights. I think the habits of stillness have roots that go down into the foundational concrete of how I was built, and that pulling them out is work, actual sustained daily work, and that the work will sometimes fail and the failure will not always be followed by the immediate corrective I would prefer. But I think, and this is the thing I most want to say on this last page, in this last letter, to this Ernesto, who is the only Ernesto there is. I think the difference between the man I was at the beginning of this notebook and the man at the end of it is not the absence of fear. The fear is still here. It is present in every word of this paragraph. The difference is that I have stopped calling the fear by the name of the virtues that resemble it at first glance. I have stopped calling it responsibility and prudence and loyalty and maturity. I have called it what it is, which is fear, and the act of calling it by its correct name does not remove it, but it does remove its disguise. And without the disguise, it is considerably less powerful, considerably less capable of being confused with wisdom. Fear without its disguise is just fear, and fear, when you can see it clearly for what it is, can be moved through, not easily, not comfortably, not without cost, but through. He stopped writing. He had reached the bottom of the page. There were 2 lines left, 2 narrow lines at the bottom of the last page of the blue notebook. The lines that had been there since the beginning, empty, waiting with the patient blankness of all unused space. He looked at them. He looked at them. He thought about what to write in them, which 2 lines should carry the weight of the end of this particular document. This particular record of 5 evenings in February in a 4th-floor apartment in a city he had never quite chosen, written by a man who had spent 15 years, not quite choosing most things, and who had spent the last 5 nights examining the cost and the shape and the precise dimensions of all that, not choosing with more honesty than he had brought to anything in his adult life. He thought about Paris. He thought about Elena turning from the painting and waiting 1 more second. He thought about the letter in the outbox pocket of his bag, sealed and addressed and 2 years overdue. He thought about Nicholas with his unmanageable hair asking the second question. He thought about Sophia at the door on a Sunday evening saying, "Figure out what you're staying for." He thought about Marcos at the Thai place, saying, "Good." Just that. Just a single word, with all the warm economy of a person who doesn't need to perform their belief in you, because the belief is simply there, has always been there, has always been the thing Ernesto was borrowing when his own ran low. He thought about his father. Not with anger. The anger had been processed and filed, and was available if needed, but was not currently operative. But was something more complicated and more useful. The particular compound feeling of understanding someone completely, while still accounting for the damage they caused. holding both things at once, the comprehension and the cost, neither canceling the other. His father had left badly. He had left with too much accumulated velocity and too little preparation, and had caused, in the leaving, the specific damage that departure causes when it's been postponed too long. Ernesto had watched that damage and learned the wrong lesson. The lesson was not, do not leave. The lesson was, learn to leave well. Learn to leave before the pressure builds past the point of clean departure. Learn that the graceful exit and the present commitment are both forms of love, and that the choice between them should be made from clarity rather than from fear of the one that causes temporary pain. He thought about the rain, 5 nights of rain, and then the clear night. And then tonight, he looked toward the window and saw that it had returned, softly, the way it sometimes returned in the small hours of February nights with no announcement, just there suddenly, the quiet tap of it against the glass. The familiar sound that had been the background of all 5 letters, and that was here again for the last one, as if it had been waiting specifically for this. As if the story required rain for its ending the way certain films require a particular light. He looked at the rain on the window for a long moment. Then he looked down at the 2 remaining lines. He wrote, "The rain is back," and on the very last line, the absolute last available line in the last page of the blue notebook that had been in the bottom drawer. "For an unknown amount of time waiting for exactly this February," he wrote. "I'm going outside." He closed the notebook. He sat with it closed for a moment, his hands flat on the cover. The way you sit with a thing that is finished and that you want to mark as finished, to give it the beat of completion that distinguishes ending from merely stopping. The notebook was finished. The excavation was complete. Not in the sense that everything had been resolved. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing was going to be resolved. Tonight resolution was a longer and more difficult and more ordinary project than 5 nights of letters could accomplish. But in the sense that the honest inventory had been taken, the structural elements had been located and named. The foundation had been assessed. The building was still standing, was going to continue to stand, was going to be operated in full knowledge of what it contained and what it was missing. And that knowledge, that clear-eyed, unsparing, specifically named knowledge, was different from not knowing, was different from the managed avoidance that had been passing for knowledge for 15 years. He put the notebook on the desk. He put it carefully, deliberately, with the respect one owes to something that has done its work fully. He set the new pen beside it, parallel, aligned the small unconscious order that hands impose when they want to mark something as significant. He looked at the envelope in the pocket of his bag, visible from where he sat. He didn't take it out. It was where it needed to be. Tomorrow it would go further. Tonight, it was exactly in the right place. Stood up, the chair chirped. He noticed it for the first time in nights as a sound with its own character rather than just background. The particular protests of the mechanism, the small articulation of metal underweight, the sound of a thing that has been used so much in the same position that it has developed a voice about it. He thought that he was going to need a different chair. A chair that didn't chirp was a small and completely manageable change, and it seemed suddenly like an appropriate place to start. Not with the grand reorganization of a life, not with the dramatic gesture, but with a chair that didn't protest every small movement. A chair appropriate for a person who intended to move. He walked to the window. The balcony door was the French kind, 2 panels of glass with a handle in the center that turned to release the latch. And Ernesto had passed through it perhaps a dozen times in 3 years of living in the apartment. Primarily in summer, primarily when heat made the interior uncomfortable enough to make even the small balcony preferable. It was not a balcony designed for extended use, barely 4 feet deep, wide enough for 2 people to stand abreast if they didn't mind proximity, with a wrought iron railing that needed repainting and a single plastic chair that he had never sat in. And that had accumulated the particular weathered quality of outdoor furniture that has experienced seasons without anyone to witness them. He turned the handle. The door opened. The air that came in was cold. February at midnight cold. The specific cold of rain-bearing air that has been moving for a while and carries the temperature of wherever it came from. And it hit him with the unambiguous clarity of something that does not soften its impact to accommodate the comfort of the recipient. He stepped out onto the balcony. The rain was light, not the driving rain of the first few evenings, Not the rain with an argument to make, but the quiet, persistent kind. The kind that falls without urgency and soaks without announcement and has about it the quality of something that intends to continue for some time, indifferent to whether its presence is welcome. It was the kind of rain that requires a decision. You either step back inside immediately, or you accept it. There is no comfortable middle position on a 4-foot balcony in February at midnight. You are either in or out. Ernesto stood in it. He gripped the railing with both hands, the wrought iron cold and slightly damp under his palms, rough with the texture of old paint over old metal, and looked out at the city. The particular view that the 4th floor of an undistinguished building in an unremarkable part of the city provides. A street, buildings of various heights, the sodium yellow of streetlights on wet pavement, a block away the orange glow of something commercial still open, further the denser luminescence of the city's more populated center, and above it all the low orange-gray sky of a city at night in rain. That specific color that is neither dark nor light, but its own category. The color of human life seen from a sufficient distance. He had looked at this view hundreds of times from behind the glass. He had looked at it the way you look at things, when there is a barrier between you and them, with perception, but without the full weight of contact, without the temperature of the air and the moisture of the rain and the cold of the railing under the hands. He had watched the rain from this window for 5 nights and processed, in its presence, the most honest, internal work he had done in 15 years. Now he was in it. The rain touched his face with the unselective democracy of weather, the way it touched the street and the railing and the abandoned plastic chair and everything else within its reach, without distinction, without preference, without the slightest interest in what the recipient of its contact was feeling about the contact. It was just rain. It was just water falling from a particular altitude onto a particular city on a particular night, doing what rain does. The same thing it had been doing for the duration of the human story and would continue to do long after the human story concluded. It did not know that Ernesto Vidal was standing in it for the first time in years, having just completed a 5-night excavation of 15 years of deliberate immobility. It did not know any of that, and would not have found it particularly remarkable if it had. But Ernesto knew. Ernesto felt it, the rain on his face, the cold of the railing, the sound of the city below, the specific sensory fact of being outside rather than inside, of having crossed the threshold between observation and participation, even in this minimal form, even on a 4-foot balcony at midnight. And he felt it not as a symbol or a metaphor or the culminating image of a 5-chapter personal narrative, but simply as a physical fact. The most ordinary and the most extraordinary kind of fact, simultaneously. The fact of being present in the moment you are actually in, without management, without the glass between you and the weather. He stood there for a long time. He thought about the other Ernesto, all of them. The accumulated gallery of versions he had constructed over 5 nights. Paris and the museum and the outbox. And the question about children and the small departures. He thought about them not with grief or envy or the particular ache of the paths not taken, but with something different. Something that had been quietly assembling itself across the 5 nights and that he now recognized for what it was. Gratitude. Not uncomplicated gratitude. Not gratitude that erased the cost of what had been given up, but the specific gratitude of someone who has been shown clearly what was possible and understands that the showing, however late, is a gift. You can't always have the life you might have had, but you can have the information about it. You can use the information. You can take the knowledge of what the other versions would have required. Courage, presence, the willingness to move before the argument starts, and bring that knowledge to bear on the life that is actually available. Which is the one you're in? Which is the one with the rain on it? Which is the only one? He thought about Nicholas. He thought about him as he always did on these particular occasions. The Sunday morning quality, the apartment 1 person short, the hair that didn't stay. And he thought about what the other Ernesto had said. The only one you can still do something about. He wasn't sure what that meant yet. Specifically, practically, in terms of the next year or the next several years of an actual life. He wasn't sure if it meant children, if the possibility was still available to him in the form it had been available at 31. If the right person and the right time and the right version of himself, the one being slowly assembled from the material of 5 nights of honesty, could still converge in a way that produced a real outcome rather than an imaginary one. He didn't know. He was comfortable not knowing, which was new, which was one of the small shifts whose magnitude he couldn't yet fully measure, but which felt, from inside, like a reorientation of fundamental importance. He didn't know. But he was going to stay available to finding out. He thought about Sophia, not with the ache of the specific loss, but with the clean, grateful recognition of what she had given him. The sentence, "Figure out what you're staying for, not what you're afraid to leave." She had handed him the tool he had needed and then left him to use it in his own time and his own way, which was exactly what he had needed and more generous than he had deserved. He hoped she was somewhere good. He had a reasonable confidence that she was, because Sophia was the kind of person who moved toward things rather than managing the distance from them, and people who move toward things tend to find them, eventually, in one form or another. He thought about his mother. He would call her tomorrow, after the outbox, before lunch if possible. A specific call. Not the maintenance call, the real one. He had been performing the role of a present son with a convincing enough approximation of presence that the performance had been accepted, and he was going to stop accepting it himself. He was going to call her the way you call someone you love and want to know and want to be known by, which requires vulnerability on both ends, and which his family had historically not been particularly well equipped for, but which he was 37 and she was 62, and neither of them had unlimited time to continue approximating closeness rather than practicing it. He thought about Marcos. He thought about the dining table, the grain of the wood, the thing that exists when you're done with it, that you can point at and say, "That is the thing I made." He thought about what the grain of his own work might look like. Not a meridian, not in the organized management of other people's information, but in something that was his, something chosen, something that had his actual mark on it, rather than his competent, neutral competence. He had ideas. He had always had ideas, kept carefully in the impractical daydream category, where they could exist without being tested, and therefore without failing. He was going to take them out of that category. He was going to look at them in the clear light of the next chapter and assess them as actual possibilities. He thought about the notebook on the desk. Closed. Complete. Already becoming the record of a before rather than an account of a present. He thought about what came after the notebook. The notebook was the excavation. What came after was the construction, which was a different kind of work, slower, more exposed, less protected by the privacy of the interior, conducted in the actual world with its actual resistance and its actual contingency, and its actual people who would be affected by the results. The construction would not have the contained drama of the excavation. The construction would have the unglamorous persistence of someone building something one ordinary day at a time, mostly without an audience, mostly without the specific electricity that accompanies the act of first naming a truth. The construction would be the part that required everything the 5 nights had produced, not as a feeling, not as a conviction, but as a daily practice, the way learning a language is a daily practice. You don't achieve fluency in 5 nights of intensive study. You achieve the beginning of fluency, and then you use it every day, imperfectly, improving incrementally, making mistakes that are the specific necessary mistakes of someone actually trying rather than someone safely not trying. He was at the beginning of fluency. He knew it. He was not going to mistake the beginning for the end, was not going to close the notebook and go to bed and wake up tomorrow a different man, was not going to let the intensity of the excavation seduce him into believing that the work was done because the inventory was taken. The inventory was taken. The work was beginning. He was still on the balcony. He had been on the balcony for he didn't know how long. Time had moved differently out here, in the rain, without the desk and the notebook and the pen to anchor it. Long enough that his hair was wet. Long enough that the cold had moved past the surface of his skin and settled into something deeper. That internal cold that requires more than a sweater to address. Long enough that his hands on the railing had the slight numbness of extended contact with cold metal. Looked up. The sky above the city was that orange-gray, that human-illuminated known color, and the rain was falling through it from some higher darkness beyond the city's light reach. And for a moment, just a moment, just one of those instants that occasionally open in ordinary time and allow you a glimpse of scale, Ernesto felt the full weight of the specific absurdity and the specific grandeur of his situation. One man on a 4-foot balcony, in the rain, at midnight. In the middle of a city of millions. In the middle of a country of hundreds of millions. In the middle of a world that was not organized around his particular struggles, and had no particular investment in whether he succeeded at the project of becoming more fully himself. And yet the balcony was real. The railing was real. The rain on his face was real. The envelope in his bag was real. The notebook on the desk was real, with its dates and its letters and its 5 nights of the most honest work he had done. And the honesty was real regardless of the scale of the world that surrounded it, regardless of its smallness in the total account of human activity. It was his. It was specific. It had happened. Had done Italiano. He had 4 or 5 consecutive nights chosen the notebook over the gap. He had, that afternoon, chosen the text message over the silence. He had at the Thai place told the truth about 5 years of avoidance to the person most likely to hold him accountable for it. He had, tonight, sealed the envelope and put it in his bag, and he was going to put it in the outbox tomorrow morning before the conversation could start. And he was standing in the rain. These were small things. He was under no illusion that they were large things. The large things were still ahead, in the actual days, the actual work, the actual sustained practice, a different way of living in his own life. But small things were where large things began. Marcos had made a dining table one day, out of wood with a particular grain, in a van workshop, with his hands. Before that, the resignation letter. Before that, 18 months of savings. Before that, a day when he decided. Before that, an elevator and a folder and 2 men who did not yet know what they were going to carry. Everything begins before you can see where it's going. Everything begins in the small and ordinary and imperfect moment that doesn't announce itself as a beginning. Ernesto looked out at the city one more time. The wet street below. The sodium lights, the orange glow of the open business. Some late-night place where someone was being served something and someone else was providing the service, and both of them were inside. Dry, probably not thinking about anything as elaborate as what Ernesto had been thinking about for 5 consecutive nights. Just inside, just warm, just the ordinary texture of a Tuesday night at midnight. He felt the rain on his face. He felt the cold of the railing. He felt his wet hair and his cold hands and the specific temperature of February air in a body that had been stationary for too long. And for the first time he tried to count back and found he couldn't identify the last time, which itself told him something for the first time in a long time. Ernesto Vidal felt entirely, specifically, undeniably located in the moment he was actually in. Not managing it, not watching it from behind glass, not holding it at the careful distance of the person who wants to see what happens without committing to being one of the people to whom it happens. In it? Just in it. He went back inside. He closed the balcony door behind him. He stood in the middle of the apartment for a moment, dripping slightly, his face and hair wet, the cold still in his hands, and looked at the room with the specific eyes of someone who has just come in from outside. The slight adjustment of the senses, the registration of warmth, the way the familiar space looks incrementally different when you've been briefly elsewhere and come back. The desk with a notebook, the envelope visible in the bag by the door. The chair that chirped, the table with its 4 chairs, 3 of them still never used. Still, the silent testament to a life that had not yet fully arrived. The window he had watched the rain through for 5 nights, and through which the rain was still visible now, falling on the empty street. Falling on everything. He went to the desk. He picked up the notebook. He held it the way he had held it on the first night, with the specific weight of something that had been in a drawer for an unknown amount of time and had, in the course of 5 evenings, become the record of the most important thing he had done in 15 years. Then he put it down, carefully, in the center of the desk where he would see it tomorrow morning when the day was still new and the arguments hadn't organized themselves yet. When to it. He lay in the dark and listened to the rain, which was still going, which seemed like it might go for a while, which suited him. He had always found it easier to fall asleep in the rain. That had always been true, since childhood. The sound of rain against windows as a specific kind of permission, a license to stop managing the day because the day was over and the rain was doing the night's work, and whatever hadn't been accomplished was going to have to wait for tomorrow, and that was acceptable. That was how it was supposed to work. Tomorrow had things in it. The outbox, the call to his mother. Another lunch with Marcos on Thursday. The ideas from the impractical daydream category, waiting to be treated as actual proposals. The question of who he was when you removed everything he had chosen by not choosing a question that was going to require not 5 nights of writing but 5 years of living to begin to answer, and which he was, for the first time, prepared to spend the time on. The question of Nicholas, not resolved, not closed, but no longer sealed. The question of what came after the notebook, which was not a question that could be answered in the notebook, which could only be answered in the world, in the actual days. One small departure at a time. He lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general. The way you think in the last minutes before sleep, when the mind is releasing its grip on the organized and the purposeful and is letting things float in their own associations. And what floated was grain and rain, and a child on some steps eating something orange, and a sentence in a museum, and a white envelope and a blue envelope and a notebook with dark blue covers and bent corners, and a balcony with rain on it and cold iron under the hands, and a city below indifferent and alive, and somewhere in the city Marcos asleep, and somewhere his mother, and somewhere people who didn't know him yet, who might, and somewhere a future that had the quality of something unwritten, not blank but unwritten, which was different. Blank is empty. Unwritten is waiting. Unwritten is the page before the pen touches it, full of everything it might become. Full of everything it might become. Ernesto Vidal, 37 years old, closed his eyes. The rain continued. Slipped, and somewhere in the city, on a desk on the 4th floor of a building without a name, a blue notebook sat in the center of a desk with a pen beside it and a new day beginning outside the window. Gray yet still dark. The city not quite started. The rain soft and continuous on the glass. The notebook was closed. Its work was done. His was just beginning. And the 5 letters of Ernesto Vidal, written over 5 consecutive February nights, were never sent. They were never addressed to anyone who could receive them. They arrived, as all honest letters eventually arrive, at the only destination they were ever really meant for. The person who wrote them returned to himself, standing in the rain,